Chapter 1. Before North Carolina was North Carolina. Long before any European flag fluttered in the breeze above the Carolina shores, long before any maps bore the names of kings and queens, there existed a land ancient and alive. Towering mountains gave way to rolling hills, which flattened into lush plains and finally merged with the wide Atlantic Ocean. The forests were dense, the rivers untamed, the skies unmarred by smoke or steel. But this land was not empty. It pulsed with life, spirit, and stories passed down for centuries. It was the homeland of peoples who had lived, hunted, farmed, and prayed here since time beyond memory. The Cherokee, the Tuscarora, and dozens of other tribes whose names have faded, but whose presence once echoed through every valley and stream bed of what we now call North Carolina. In the rugged Appalachian highlands, the Cherokee thrived in scattered towns, nestled in mountain coves and along winding rivers. Their world was a balanced one. They believed in harmony with nature, in the sacredness of the land, and in a spiritual order that connected all living things. The Cherokee were not a wandering people. They built permanent homes of timber and mud, with council houses at the heart of each village. Women tended the crops, corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters that sustained their people, while men hunted deer and fished in the clear, cold rivers. Stories were shared around fires, not just for entertainment, but as vessels of memory, law, and tradition. The earth was not something to conquer, but a mother to be honored. Further east, the lands flattened and the rivers widened. Here lived the Tuscarora, a powerful people who spoke an Iroquoian tongue and had built their lives among the rich forests and fertile lands of the coastal plains. They too built towns with wooden palisades and longhouses, often overlooking rivers like the Neuse and the Roanoke. The Tuscarora were traders, diplomats, and warriors, connected not only by blood, but by a shared network of alliances stretching into what is now New York and Pennsylvania. Their goods, woven mats, deerskins, pottery, and dried fish, moved along trade routes that had existed for centuries, crisscrossing the entire eastern woodlands of North America. But the Cherokee and Tuscarora were not alone. North Carolina was a patchwork of tribal nations, each with its own language, customs, and beliefs. The Saponi, Occaneechi, Meherrin, Catawba, and others called this land home, forming confederations, rivalries, and alliances that predated the arrival of Europeans by hundreds of years. These peoples understood the rhythms of the seasons, the migrations of animals, the flowering of plants. They navigated by stars and landmarks, not compasses, and their sense of geography was intimate and sacred. Rivers were not just water. They were lifelines, spiritual veins that flowed through the body of the world. Spirituality was not separate from daily life. The Cherokee believed in the power of dreams, in the messages of animals, in the presence of the little people, mysterious spirits said to dwell in the mountains. Ceremonies marked births, harvests, and deaths. Medicine men carried the knowledge of herbs, healing chants, and sacred rituals. The green corn ceremony, one of the most important seasonal events, was both a time of renewal and social order, a symbolic cleansing before the arrival of the new harvest. Fire was holy, a gift from the Creator, and it burned at the center of every ritual. These societies had their own forms of government, often based on consensus. Cherokee towns were governed by councils, with peace chiefs and war chiefs taking turns in leadership depending on the season. Women held significant power. Matrilineal inheritance was common, and elder women often had the final word in clan matters. These were not primitive societies, as they would later be described by outsiders, but sophisticated and deeply rooted civilizations with laws, economies, and complex social hierarchies. And then, without warning, everything began to change. Far across the ocean, in the courts of European kings and the minds of ambitious explorers, rumors of a new world had taken root. Gold, glory, and God. They were the three motivators of conquest, and in the late 1500s, ships began appearing off the Carolina coast. With them came diseases unknown to native immune systems, along with guns, iron tools, and a hunger for land that would not be satisfied. The first contact was often cautious, sometimes curious, even friendly. But misunderstandings piled upon fears. The Tuscarora, who had long been wary of the growing encroachment by European settlers, especially in the Albemarle and Pamlico regions, would eventually be pushed into open war. Their defeat in the Tuscarora War of the early 1700s would mark a turning point, not just for their people, many of whom fled north to join the Iroquois Confederacy, but for all native nations in the region. The Cherokee, too, would find themselves caught in an ever-tightening web of treaties, betrayals, and broken promises, as settlers poured over the mountains in the 18th century. Drawn by the promise of fertile land and independence, they disrupted the careful balance the Cherokee had maintained with the land and with neighboring tribes for generations. Even before the Trail of Tears, there were smaller trails of loss. Villages abandoned, hunting grounds overrun, sacred places defiled. Yet even in the face of this slow-motion catastrophe, many native traditions endured. Stories were passed down in secret. Dances and songs continued in remote hollows and forest clearings. Identity bent, but did not break. And though the shape of North Carolina would be forever altered by the arrival of colonists, the echoes of its first peoples never fully disappeared. They linger in place names, like Catawba, Pamlico, and Cherokee, and in the land itself, which still remembers those who first walked it with reverence. As the 17th century dawned and the English crown turned its attention more deliberately to the New World, the land that had once been a web of native nations was slowly becoming a battleground of empires. Trade gave way to conquest. Curiosity became colonization, and the seeds of a new society, restless, ambitious, and forever hungry, were being planted on soil rich with the memory of those who came before. And so began the colonial chapter of North Carolina's history. But to understand what was gained, we must always remember what was lost. Because this story, like all American stories, begins not with ships on the horizon, but with a forest full of voices, a sky full of stars, and a land already called home. Shadows were beginning to fall over the eastern shores, and soon a mysterious settlement called Roanoke would rise and vanish, leaving behind one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in American history. Chapter 2. The Lost Colony of Roanoke. When the English first cast their eyes westward across the vast Atlantic, they saw more than an ocean. They saw possibility, empire, gold, perhaps, glory, certainly. But for some, there was something more enduring, an idea of permanence, of planting a seed in the new world that would one day grow into something greater. Among those dreamers stood Sir Walter Raleigh, a favorite of Queen Elizabeth I, ambitious, charismatic, and consumed by the desire to establish England's first permanent settlement in the Americas. What began with vision and royal favor would end in silence, mystery, and one of the most enduring legends in American history: the lost colony of Roanoke. It was 1584 when Raleigh secured a charter from the Queen, authorizing him to explore and colonize land in North America. The territory he claimed was vast, stretching from present-day South Carolina to Nova Scotia, and he named it Virginia, in honor of the Virgin Queen. But Raleigh would never step foot in the land he so passionately promoted. Instead, he dispatched others, navigators, soldiers, craftsmen, to scout the coast and find a suitable place for settlement. What they discovered was a chain of barrier islands off the present-day coast of North Carolina, a place of serene beauty and strategic promise. Roanoke Island would be the starting point. The first voyages were exploratory, and the native people they encountered, especially the Secotan and Croatan tribes, were cautious but not immediately hostile. Early reports painted the land as lush, the climate as temperate, and the potential as boundless. But even in these first encounters, tension simmered beneath the surface. Cultural misunderstandings turned to suspicion. Supplies ran low, the dream flickered. In 1585, Raleigh sent a larger group, about 100 men, under the command of Sir Richard Grenville. This first colony struggled from the start. Poor planning, lack of food, and rising tensions with native tribes, exacerbated by the English arrogance and violent reprisals, poisoned the fragile alliance. Grenville eventually returned to England for supplies, leaving Ralph Lane in charge. Lane, a military man, soon found himself leading not settlers, but survivors. The men quarreled with the locals, raided villages, and killed a native chief. The situation deteriorated quickly. When Sir Francis Drake happened to arrive with his fleet in 1586, the colonists didn't hesitate. They abandoned Roanoke and sailed home. Raleigh, undeterred, tried again. In 1587, a new group of settlers, this time including women and children, set sail for Roanoke. This second expedition, led by John White, was different. It was meant to be a true colony, a permanent foothold in the New World. Among the settlers was White's pregnant daughter, Eleanor Dare, who would soon give birth to Virginia Dare, the first English child born on American soil. Spirits were high. But when they arrived, they found the original settlement abandoned and in disrepair. The site was rebuilt, relations with the natives cautiously reopened, and the colonists prepared for life in a land far from home. But trouble came quickly. The colony lacked food, tools, and the means to defend itself. The Croatan tribe remained relatively friendly, but others, remembering the violence of the previous expedition, were not. The colonists urged John White to return to England to plead for help. He was reluctant to leave his daughter and granddaughter, but he agreed, sailing away with promises to return swiftly. White could not have known that he would not see Roanoke again for 3 long years. England was gripped by war. The Spanish Armada loomed, and every available ship was called into service to defend the homeland. White found himself stranded, powerless, caught in the storm of geopolitics. He petitioned, pleaded, waited. Finally, in 1590, he secured passage back to Roanoke. When he arrived, the settlement was eerily silent. There were no signs of struggle, no bodies, no burned buildings, no shattered remnants of war or disease, only absence. The colony had vanished. White found 2 clues: the word Croatoan carved into a post, and the letters CRO etched into a nearby tree. Before he had left in 1587, White and the colonists had agreed that if they were forced to abandon the site, they would leave a sign, and if danger had been involved, they would add a cross. There was no cross. White interpreted Croatoan to mean the colonists had moved to Croatoan Island, present-day Hatteras Island, home of the friendly tribe. He was eager to search, but a fierce storm and the stubbornness of his crew forced him to abandon the mission. He sailed back to England, never to return. And so the mystery began. What happened to the lost colony of Roanoke? Historians have proposed countless theories. The most accepted is that the settlers, low on supplies and increasingly isolated, simply integrated with the Croatan people. Archaeological discoveries have found evidence of European artifacts among native villages on Hatteras Island, supporting this idea. Perhaps they abandoned their English identity and merged into a culture more likely to help them survive. Others propose darker possibilities, that the settlers were slaughtered by hostile tribes, that they tried to sail back to England and were lost at sea, that they starved, died from disease, or fractured into smaller groups that dispersed across the land and disappeared into history. And then there are the legends. Some spoke of ghostly settlers seen wandering the woods. Others whispered of a cursed land where no colony could ever take root. Virginia Dare herself became a figure of folklore. Some said she grew into a white doe, hunted by her own people, a symbol of innocence lost and transformation. She remains a haunting figure in Southern mythology, as if the land itself remembers her and refuses to forget. Roanoke became more than a failed colony. It became a story, a blank page onto which every generation projected its own fears and fantasies. For some, it was a cautionary tale about hubris and poor planning. For others, it was a symbol of American mystery, a riddle written in the wild. Its silence became its power. And even as Jamestown rose in Virginia 2 decades later, becoming the first successful English settlement in America, Roanoke lingered in the imagination. It was the ghost of a beginning, the road not taken, the child who vanished before the dawn of the nation. What might have been had they survived? Today, Roanoke Island is peaceful. Tourists stroll its shores, unaware that they tread on sacred ground, on soil that once held dreams, now swallowed by sand and time. The winds still blow through the trees. The word Croatoan still haunts the storybooks. But if you listen carefully, if you close your eyes and let the forest speak, you might hear echoes of those who vanished. The cries of a newborn, the crackle of a fire, the silence of a colony that dared to begin something, and instead became a question mark at the very start of American history. From this mystery, North Carolina's story would move forward, not through myth, but through survival. Colonists would return to its shores. Towns would rise, conflict would ignite. And in the centuries to come, the land once whispered about in London courtrooms would become a cornerstone of rebellion, identity, and change. But no matter how many cities are built or wars are fought, the lost colony of Roanoke remains, timeless, unsolved, and deeply American. A reminder that even at the beginning of our history, not all stories come with answers. Some are meant to linger, to haunt, to invite us to wonder what lies just beyond the edge of the map. And as the tide pulled the last English footprint from Roanoke's sand, a new era was beginning, not of dreams, but of empires. North Carolina was no longer a whispered myth in a queen's court. It was land to be taken, tamed, and transformed. The age of colonization had begun. Chapter 3: The Turbulent Birth of Carolina. The mystery of Roanoke never found a resolution, but the English crown was not in the habit of surrendering dreams so easily. As the 1600s unfolded, and as other colonies like Jamestown and Plymouth slowly began to take root, attention once again turned south, to the forests, swamps, and shores of what would become Carolina. But this time, the venture would not be driven by knights and adventurers seeking glory, but by powerful men with paper and parchment, by kings, proprietors, and eventually by pirates. England's hold on the North American coastline was tightening. By the mid-17th century, the Crown had granted large tracts of land to loyal supporters, often in payment for political favors or wartime debts. In 1663, King Charles II, recently restored to the throne after the turmoil of the English Civil War, granted a massive land charter to 8 noblemen, his trusted allies, known collectively as the Lords Proprietors. This land stretched from Virginia to Spanish Florida, and westward as far as the Pacific, though no one had ever seen that far. They called it Carolina, in honor of the king's father, Charles I. But while the name was elegant, the reality was chaos. Carolina was a wild place, thick with pine forests, tangled with rivers, crawling with mosquitoes and mystery. The northern part, what would later become North Carolina, was particularly stubborn. Settlers from Virginia had already drifted southward into the Albemarle region, carving out small farms in the dense woods. They were independent, rough-edged, and fiercely suspicious of authority. They paid little attention to the Lords Proprietors and even less to taxes. Governance was more theory than fact. At first, the proprietors tried to impose order through grand ideas. They drafted the Fundamental Constitutions of Carolina, a sweeping document co-written by the philosopher John Locke, which envisioned a feudal society with noble titles, massive estates, and a rigid class hierarchy. But the people who had come to the Carolina frontier, farmers, indentured servants, second sons without inheritance, had no interest in European nobility or philosophical utopias. They came for land, for escape, for survival. And they weren't the only ones arriving. As Carolina's coastline opened, it became a landing ground for a dizzying mix of peoples. Scots-Irish immigrants came fleeing poverty and persecution. French Huguenots sought refuge from Catholic repression. Germans, Swiss, and Dutch settlers carved out towns in the foothills and river valleys. Alongside them came enslaved Africans, first in small numbers, then in thousands, brought through the ports of Charleston and Edenton to labor on plantations, to build roads, to serve households, and to endure a brutal system that would define the region's economy and soul for generations. Slavery was not just an economic arrangement. It was a system of power, enforced by violence, justified by law, and embedded in the foundations of the colony. Even in its earliest days, Carolina's laws were quick to draw hard lines between white and black, free and enslaved, landowner and laborer. Africans brought to Carolina came from various cultures, languages, and religions. But under slavery, they were forced into a new identity, one shaped by resistance, adaptation, and quiet defiance. They carried with them stories, rhythms, and memories from across the Atlantic. And though the chains sought to erase them, a new African-American culture began to emerge in the fields and quarters of early Carolina. But life was not easy for anyone on the frontier. Swamps and disease killed just as surely as any sword. Food was often scarce. And to make matters worse, the coast became a haven for a different kind of settler, men who lived by a different law. The pirates, the Outer Banks, with their hidden inlets and treacherous shoals, proved to be the perfect hideout for seafaring outlaws. English authorities, distant and disorganized, could barely patrol the coastline. Merchants sailed up and down the Atlantic coast with gold, sugar, and spices, and pirates were all too eager to relieve them of their burdens. None was more infamous than Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard. Blackbeard was not just a pirate. He was a performer, a master of fear, with lit fuses tucked into his long black beard, creating a halo of smoke as he strode the deck. He commanded the Queen Anne's Revenge, a warship turned pirate vessel, armed to the teeth and manned by a loyal crew. For a time in the early 1700s, he ruled the Carolina coast like a shadow king, plundering ships, blockading ports, and striking terror into the hearts of merchants and governors alike. Yet Blackbeard was more than a villain. In some towns, he was a local legend. He traded with settlers, threw parties, and bribed officials. Some say he even accepted a royal pardon, trying to retire in Bath, North Carolina, before being lured back into piracy. Whether he truly wanted to change is unclear. What is clear is how he met his end. In 1718, the governor of Virginia, tired of the pirates' menace, sent a British naval force under Lieutenant Robert Maynard to hunt him down. The two forces met in the shallow waters of Ocracoke Inlet. The battle was brutal and bloody. Blackbeard was shot 5 times and slashed more than 20. He died standing, swinging his sword until the very end. His head was severed and hung from the bow of Maynard's ship as a warning. But his legend never died. As piracy declined and imperial control tightened, the lords proprietors continued to lose their grip on Carolina. The settlers, especially in the north, resented them deeply. They saw the proprietors as distant landlords who taxed them without offering protection or support. Uprisings broke out, including the Cary Rebellion, in which settlers protested against religious restrictions and centralized authority. By the 1720s, the experiment in proprietary rule was collapsing. The Crown stepped in. In 1729, North Carolina and South Carolina were officially separated and became royal colonies, directly under the rule of the British king. For North Carolina, this marked the beginning of a new chapter, one in which infrastructure slowly improved, courts were established, and royal governors tried to bring order to the scattered settlements. But the independent spirit that had taken root in the swamps and backwoods of early Carolina did not fade. It only grew. The same people who had harbored pirates, resisted proprietors, and forged new lives in a brutal landscape were now laying the groundwork for something even more radical. An identity built on resistance to distant rulers, suspicion of centralized power, and a fierce sense of self-determination. The colony had begun as a chaotic experiment, a patchwork of ambition, desperation, and survival. It had been shaped by kings who had never seen it, by pirates who terrorized it, by enslaved men and women who toiled in silence, and by immigrants who cleared forests and buried children in foreign soil. It was a place of contradiction, where dreams collided with violence, and where every inch of progress was paid for in blood, sweat, or betrayal. And yet, by the mid-18th century, the bones of a colony had formed. Towns like Edenton, New Bern, and Wilmington rose on the coast. Trade routes were established. Plantations spread across the flatlands. And in the west, settlers pushed into the Appalachian frontier, clashing with native tribes and carving out homesteads in lands still untamed. But beneath the surface, the colony remained restless. The scars of its chaotic birth had not healed. The wounds of slavery were deepening. The memory of pirate ships, of lawless governors, and of forgotten promises still lingered in the minds of those who called North Carolina home. They were not loyal subjects of empire. They were survivors of swamp and storm, of betrayal and ambition. And as the 1700s wore on, the fire of rebellion began to flicker once more. This time, however, it would not be pirates or proprietors who challenged the crown. It would be the people themselves. The regulator movement was rising in the backcountry. Farmers and frontiersmen were tired of corrupt officials, heavy taxes, and the grip of distant rulers. What began as protest would soon lead to open confrontation, foreshadowing a revolution that would shake the entire continent. North Carolina, born in turbulence, would soon become one of the first to raise its voice in defiance, and the world would never be the same again. Chapter 4. Revolution Brews in the Backcountry. The colony of North Carolina had never been an easy land to govern. From its earliest days under the Lords Proprietors to its years as a royal colony, it was a place marked by stubborn independence and a suspicion of authority. The very geography seemed to shape this character. The swamps and tangled rivers of the east made communication difficult, while the rugged hills and mountains of the west fostered communities that were isolated, self-reliant, and fiercely protective of their freedoms. It was here, in the backcountry, that a new spirit began to rise. One that would set North Carolina on a collision course with the British Crown and place it unexpectedly at the forefront of America's fight for independence. By the mid-17th century, North Carolina's population was growing rapidly. Immigrants streamed into the colony, not just from England, but from Scotland, Ireland, Germany, and Switzerland. Many settled in the western backcountry, carving farms out of the wilderness. These settlers lived hard lives. They were far from the wealthy planters and coastal elites who dominated the colonial assembly and controlled the flow of trade. For backcountry farmers, the government seemed distant, corrupt, and hostile. Taxes were high, courts were crooked, and the officials who enforced the law were often more interested in lining their own pockets than dispensing justice. Resentment smoldered, and by the 1760s, it began to erupt into open defiance. This movement came to be known as the Regulator Movement, and it would mark North Carolina as a breeding ground for revolution. The regulators were not refined political philosophers. They were farmers, hunters, tradesmen, and small landowners, angry at sheriffs who seized their property, judges who demanded bribes, and tax collectors who grew fat while their neighbors starved. They wanted fair treatment, honest courts, and a government that served the people rather than exploited them. Their protests began with petitions and assemblies. They demanded reform, wrote letters, and voiced their grievances. But when their words were ignored, their anger turned to action. In the hills and valleys of the Piedmont, crowds gathered to prevent courts from sitting. Tax offices were attacked. Officials were beaten, humiliated, even run out of town. In some places, regulators refused to pay taxes altogether, daring the Crown's agents to come and take what they demanded. For nearly a decade, the colony teetered between order and chaos, with the regulators testing the limits of royal authority and the royal governor determined to crush them. That governor was William Tryon, a man remembered in history with little affection. Tryon was ambitious and proud, a symbol of everything the backcountry settlers despised. He raised taxes to build an extravagant governor's mansion in New Bern, a palace of stone and marble in a colony where many of his subjects still lived in log cabins. To the regulators, this palace was an insult, a symbol of corruption and the arrogance of power. The conflict came to a head in 1771 at the Battle of Alamance. Several thousand regulators, poorly armed and untrained, gathered to face Tryon's militia. They carried muskets, hunting rifles, farm tools, and sheer determination. They believed they were standing for justice, for their rights as free men, against a government that had turned its back on them. Tryon, however, saw only rebellion. He ordered his troops to fire. The battle was short and bloody. The regulators, with no cannon and little organization, could not stand against the disciplined militia. Dozens were killed, many more captured. 6 leaders were executed as traitors. The regulator movement was crushed, but its spirit did not die. If anything, Alamance lit a fire that burned brighter in the years to come. For many in North Carolina, the lesson was clear. The government would not listen to peaceful petitions. Change would come only through resistance. This resistance deepened as the 1770s unfolded. Across the colonies, tensions with Britain were rising. Taxes imposed from London, restrictions on trade, and the presence of British troops bred resentment. In Boston, the Tea Party made headlines. In Virginia, Patrick Henry thundered for liberty. But in North Carolina, far from the centers of power, ordinary people were also stirring. In Mecklenburg County in 1775, local leaders issued what became known as the Mecklenburg Resolves. This bold declaration asserted that British laws no longer held authority in the county, and that local governance would be carried out by the people themselves. Though debated by historians, the spirit of the document was unmistakable. It was one of the earliest expressions of independence in the colonies, a radical step that foreshadowed the Declaration of Independence itself. A year later, in April 1776, the colony took an even more decisive step. In the town of Halifax, the Provincial Congress of North Carolina gathered to debate the growing crisis with Britain. By now, blood had been spilled at Lexington and Concord. War was no longer a possibility, but a reality. In Halifax, the delegates passed what became known as the Halifax Resolves, a resolution that authorized North Carolina's representatives in the Continental Congress to vote for independence. This was more than a symbolic gesture. North Carolina became the first colony to officially call for complete separation from Britain. It was an act of courage, of defiance, and of vision. The colony that had once seemed fractious, poor, and unruly had now stepped forward as a leader. Its voice was clear. The time for compromise was over. The time for freedom had come. From these moments grew North Carolina's proud motto, "First in freedom." While other colonies hesitated, North Carolina embraced the cause of independence with a fervor born from years of struggle against corruption, exploitation, and tyranny. The same spirit that had driven the regulators into battle at Alamance now propelled the colony into revolution. But it is important to remember that this revolution was not a clean break or a unified chorus. The colony was divided. Coastal elites, many with ties to Britain, hesitated or resisted. Loyalists, who remained faithful to the crown, clashed with patriots in brutal civil conflicts that tore communities apart. Neighbors turned on neighbors, families were split, and violence spread across the backcountry. The revolution in North Carolina was not only a war against a foreign king, it was a war among its own people. Enslaved Africans, too, found themselves caught in the upheaval. The British offered freedom to those who escaped patriot masters and joined the royal cause. Some took the chance, fleeing plantations and risking everything for liberty, even if it meant fighting for the very empire that had enslaved them. Others stayed, hoping that the rhetoric of freedom might one day extend to them. For many, the revolution was both a beacon of hope and a bitter reminder of promises unfulfilled. The Cherokee and other native nations face their own impossible choices. Pressured by encroaching settlers, courted by both British and Patriot forces, they fought to preserve their lands and sovereignty. Some sided with the Crown, believing British promises of protection. Others struck bargains with the Patriots. But in the end, they too suffered displacement and loss as the tide of settlement continued to push westward. Still, amid the turmoil, the idea of liberty gained ground. In town meetings, churches, and taverns, North Carolinians debated the future. They argued, they fought, they bled. But out of the chaos came a shared conviction that they would no longer live as subjects of a distant king. They would be citizens of something new. When the Declaration of Independence was finally signed in 1776, North Carolina's role was already written in bold letters. Its people had demanded freedom early, had risked their lives for it, and had carried the scars of resistance long before the first shots of the Revolution were fired. The road ahead would be brutal, filled with battles, shortages, and sacrifices. But the colony had made its choice, and there was no turning back. The back country, once dismissed as unruly and lawless, had become the crucible of revolution. The regulators' cries for justice, the defiance of Mecklenburg, the boldness of Halifax, all these threads wove together into a banner of freedom that North Carolinians carried proudly. They had stood against their own governors, against corruption, and now they would stand against an empire. And so, as war engulfed the colonies, North Carolina's story turned to battlefields and sacrifice. The Revolution had begun in earnest, and the Tar Heel state would soon face the brutal test of fire and steel that came with it. But even before the smoke of war darkened its skies, North Carolina had already earned its place in history. It was, and would remain, first in freedom. Chapter 5. The American Revolution in North Carolina. When North Carolina declared itself first in freedom, it did so with fire in its heart and blood already on its hands. The Halifax resolves had laid the ideological foundation, but words alone could not secure liberty. The British Empire, vast and well-armed, would not yield without a fight. And as the war for independence spread across the colonies, North Carolina stepped forward, not as a distant spectator, but as an active and vital battleground. In fields, forests, and forgotten crossroads, the people of this young state would prove their commitment through sacrifice, strategy, and surprising resilience. At the start of the war, North Carolina's geography seemed to make it a side player. Its long, swampy coastlines and rugged inland terrain were far from the political and military centers of New England and Virginia. But it didn't take long for the war to reach its doorsteps. Loyalists and patriots clashed almost immediately, often in brutal skirmishes that pitted neighbors, and sometimes family members, against one another. The lines of loyalty were blurred. This wasn't just a war between colonies and a king. It was a civil war, and North Carolina was caught in its crosshairs. One of the first significant military actions in the state came in February 1776, just months before the Declaration of Independence was signed. At the Battle of Moore's Creek Bridge, near Wilmington, a patriot force of about 1,000 men faced off against a group of nearly 800 loyalists, many of them Scottish Highlanders who had recently arrived in the colony and still held deep loyalty to the crown. The loyalists, armed mostly with broadswords and confidence, charged across a narrow, swampy bridge, only to be met by a wall of musket fire. The battle was over in minutes, Dozens of Loyalists lay dead or wounded. The rest fled in chaos. Though small, the victory at Moore's Creek Bridge was profound. It shattered the momentum of Loyalist forces in the region and boosted morale throughout the colony. It also gave the Patriot cause legitimacy in the South, signaling that the war for independence wasn't just a Northern affair. It belonged to every colony, and the people of North Carolina would not sit idle. As war spread, North Carolinians answered the call to arms. Militias sprang up in every county, made up of farmers, blacksmiths, teachers, and teenagers. These men were not professional soldiers. They lacked uniforms, often trained with hunting rifles, and supplied their own food and ammunition. But what they lacked in polish, they made up for in resolve. They knew the woods, the creeks, the back roads, and they fought not for empire or paycheck, but for home. The Continental Army, too, drew heavily from North Carolina. Thousands served in major battles up and down the East Coast, from Brandywine to Saratoga to Valley Forge. They endured bitter winters, disease, and staggering losses. Yet they kept fighting. Some served under General George Washington himself. Others fought under Nathaniel Greene, the brilliant Southern commander who would later become essential to the Patriot victory in the Carolinas. But as the war dragged on, the British shifted their strategy. After years of frustration in the North, they turned their eyes southward, hoping to ignite Loyalist support and isolate New England. The Southern Campaign, as it became known, would bring some of the most vicious fighting of the entire war. North Carolina was no longer a peripheral battlefield, it was now a primary target. In 1780, after the fall of Charleston and the defeat of American forces at Camden, South Carolina, British troops poured into the backcountry. Led by General Lord Cornwallis, they aimed to secure the Carolinas and marched northward through Virginia. But they underestimated the ferocity of local resistance. One of the most dramatic moments came at the Battle of Kings Mountain, just across the border in South Carolina, but fought largely by men from North Carolina. These men, known as the Over-Mountain Men, had come from the Appalachian frontier, rugged, self-sufficient fighters who refused to let the war be decided by British officers or Loyalist threats. In October 1780, they surrounded and annihilated a force of Loyalist militia commanded by Major Patrick Ferguson. Ferguson, the only British officer at the battle, was killed. The rest of his force was killed, wounded, or captured. Kings Mountain was more than a tactical victory. It sent a chilling message to Cornwallis. The backcountry could not be tamed. There would be no easy march through the Carolinas. The people here would resist, fiercely, endlessly, and with everything they had. In early 1781, Cornwallis pushed deeper into North Carolina, hoping to crush what he saw as scattered rebellion. He marched into the heart of the state, capturing towns, looting supplies, and trying to rally Loyalist support. But instead of submission, he met opposition at every turn. Patriots shadowed his army, disrupted his supply lines, and fought him in every valley and village. The most significant engagement during this phase was the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, fought near present-day Greensboro. General Nathaniel Greene, commanding a force of both Continental soldiers and local militia, faced Cornwallis head-on. Greene's forces were outnumbered and outgunned, but he used the terrain skillfully, deploying his troops in 3 defensive lines, using the woods to slow and bleed the advancing British. The fighting was intense. Smoke filled the forest, musket fire echoed through the trees, and men fell on both sides. Cornwallis ultimately forced the Americans to retreat. But his victory came at a terrible cost. He lost nearly a quarter of his army, men he could not replace. It was a Pyrrhic victory, and it marked the beginning of the end for British hopes in the South. Exhausted and battered, Cornwallis withdrew to Virginia, where he would eventually be trapped and forced to surrender at Yorktown later that year. But the road to Yorktown had run straight through North Carolina, and the blood spilled on its soil had helped pave the way to American independence. Yet the revolution in North Carolina wasn't fought only with muskets and sabers. It was fought in political halls, in whispered debates, and in the minds of ordinary people. In 1776, North Carolina adopted its first state constitution, establishing a new government independent of royal control. This was no easy task. The state's deep divisions between East and West, rich and poor, patriot and loyalist, made consensus difficult. But the Constitution, with all its imperfections, was a bold step. It declared that power derived from the people, not from kings. It guaranteed certain rights and liberties. It established the framework for a democratic government that would outlive the war. Women, too, played critical, if often unrecognized, roles in the Revolution. They managed farms, raised children, smuggled supplies, and served as spies. Some disguised themselves as men to fight. Others nursed the wounded or carried messages through enemy lines. Their courage and resilience kept families alive and communities intact as the war raged around them. And then there were the enslaved, for whom the promise of liberty remained heartbreakingly out of reach. Some took the opportunity to escape, fleeing to British lines in exchange for a vague promise of freedom. Others were forcibly conscripted to build fortifications, haul supplies, or serve their masters in the field. The Revolution opened a door, but for many African Americans in North Carolina, it would be generations before they were allowed to walk through it. When the war finally ended in 1783, North Carolina was no longer just a rebellious colony. It was a state, a bruised but proud member of a new nation. Its contribution had been decisive, if not always glamorous. It had supplied troops, resisted occupation, and stood its ground when few thought it could. But the real legacy of North Carolina's Revolution was not found in any single battle or proclamation. It was in the thousands of unnamed individuals who had chosen resistance over submission, courage over fear, and hope over despair. They had fought not for the glories of empire or even the perfection of principle, but for the simple, radical belief that their lives belonged to them. And in that belief, a state was truly born, one forged in struggle, baptized in blood, and forever marked by the long road it had taken to freedom. The fight for independence was over, but the fight to define what that independence meant, who it belonged to, who it excluded, and what kind of future it promised, was just beginning. North Carolina, the Tar Heels state, would carry its revolutionary scars into the new century. But it would also carry something else, the unshakable idea that freedom, once claimed, could never be quietly surrendered. Not then, not ever. Chapter 6. Slavery, Cotton, and the Antebellum South. When the smoke of revolution cleared and the young American Republic began to take shape, North Carolina stood both proud and precarious. It had fought hard for independence, shed blood for liberty, and emerged as a full-fledged state in the new Union. But beneath the patriotic songs and fresh constitutions, a deeper contradiction remained. For while the state had declared all men to be free and equal in their rejection of monarchy, many of its people remained enslaved. As the 19th century began, North Carolina entered a new chapter, not of revolution, but of entrenchment, a time when the promise of liberty was narrowed and the chains of slavery grew heavier. It was the rise of the plantation South. The decades following the Revolutionary War were years of dramatic change. The invention of the cotton gin in 1793 by Eli Whitney transformed Southern agriculture almost overnight. What had once been a labor-intensive, marginally profitable crop now became the engine of an empire. Cotton could now be processed quickly, spun into fabric, and shipped around the world. It was soft, strong, and in constant demand. And in the American South, it grew easily in the long, hot summers and fertile soils. It became king. In eastern North Carolina, where the land was flat and the rivers wide, planters seized the opportunity. They expanded their holdings, bought more land, and cleared enormous tracts for cultivation. Cotton, along with tobacco, became the backbone of the state's economy. These crops were labor-hungry, and that labor came not from free men, but from enslaved Africans and African Americans. As cotton rose, so too did the number of people held in bondage. By the early 1800s, slavery was no longer just an institution. It was a system deeply embedded in every facet of Southern life. The enslaved worked the fields from sunup to sundown, cleared forests, built roads, raised livestock, and labored in kitchens, barns, and workshops. Their labor enriched their owners, supported local economies, and created a way of life for the planter class that was both extravagant and brutal. In towns like Edenton, Fayetteville, and Wilmington, slavery became the foundation upon which wealth and status were built. The coastal elite, many descended from early colonial families, now lived in grand plantation homes with porches wrapped in white columns and ballrooms filled with imported furnishings. Their children were educated in the North or even in Europe. Their wealth allowed them political influence, social prestige, and the illusion of permanence. But it was all balanced on the backs of others. Behind the elegance was cruelty. Families torn apart at auction blocks, whippings carried out without trial or appeal, and lives reduced to ledger entries. To justify this system, the elites built an ideology. They spoke of paternalism, of a natural order, of civilization and Christian duty. Ministers preached sermons claiming slavery was ordained by God. Politicians argued it was essential to Southern prosperity. Writers romanticized the plantation as a place of harmony and virtue. And though enslaved people were denied literacy, voice, and rights, they resisted in ways both subtle and overt. They broke tools, feigned illness, preserved African traditions, whispered songs of deliverance, and, when possible, fled north through the secret network of safe houses known as the Underground Railroad. But not all of North Carolina lived in the shadow of cotton and columns. In the western mountains and backcountry foothills, life was different. The soil was thinner, the terrain rugged, and the climate less forgiving. Large plantations were rare. Instead, families lived on small farms, working the land themselves, raising corn, hogs, and enough to survive. These were the descendants of Scots-Irish immigrants, German settlers, and Revolutionary veterans who had claimed their piece of the frontier. They valued self-reliance, simplicity, and independence. And while some of these families owned a few enslaved individuals, most did not. Their connection to slavery was distant and often uneasy. This cultural divide between the eastern planters and the western farmers grew with every passing year. The coastal elite controlled the state legislature, passed laws to protect their wealth, and taxed the backcountry to fund projects in their own region. Roads were built for the planters, railroads for the ports, and schools for their children. Meanwhile, the mountain folk felt ignored, exploited, and increasingly alienated from the government that claimed to represent them. The tension was not merely economic, it was moral and political. As abolitionist ideas spread in the North, some in the western parts of North Carolina began to question the future of slavery. Others remained indifferent, but resented being ruled by wealthy men whose values they did not share. The issue of slavery, which enriched the East, burdened the West with political consequences and threatened to pull the state apart from within. Still, the Eastern planter class remained firmly in control. They passed laws restricting the rights of free blacks, banning abolitionist literature, and increasing patrols to catch runaways. The fear of rebellion loomed large. In 1831, this fear exploded into panic after Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia, just across the border. Turner, an enslaved preacher, had led a violent uprising that left over 50 white people dead. Though the rebellion was quickly crushed, it sent shockwaves through North Carolina's slaveholding communities. The legislature responded with harsh new laws, outlawing the teaching of reading and writing to enslaved people, restricting black gatherings, and expanding the power of slave patrols. Despite the repression, free black communities did exist in the state, particularly in urban areas like Wilmington and New Bern. These communities were often composed of skilled laborers, artisans, and entrepreneurs who had purchased their freedom or been born free. They built churches, established schools, and formed tight-knit networks of support. Yet they lived under constant surveillance. Their rights limited, their safety never guaranteed. At any moment, freedom could be questioned, revoked, or erased. By the 1850s, the national debate over slavery had reached a boiling point. The Compromise of 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act, and the violent clashes in Kansas all pointed toward a nation on the edge. In North Carolina, the planter class dug in deeper. Their wealth, identity, and political power were all bound to the institution of slavery. They saw any threat to it as a threat to their very existence. Secessionists in the state began to whisper more loudly. They watched as South Carolina moved toward breaking from the Union and asked themselves whether North Carolina would follow. But in the mountains and foothills, the mood was different. Many Westerners viewed secession as a reckless move, a decision that would only serve the interests of the elite and drag poor farmers into a war they did not ask for. The divide between the two North Carolinas, coastal and mountain, planter and farmer, enslaver and laborer, was sharper than ever, even within the slaveholding class. There were those who sensed a storm on the horizon. Cotton prices fluctuated. Northern pressure increased. Underground networks smuggled more enslaved people to freedom. And the dream of a stable, unchallenged Southern empire began to show cracks. Some clung more tightly to slavery in response. Others, privately, began to wonder if the future would look very different from the past they had built. As the 1860s approached, North Carolina was a state on the edge. Prosperous in its eastern fields, proud of its past, but quietly fractured within. Slavery was not just a practice. It was the scaffolding upon which everything had been constructed. To question it was to question the social order, the economy, the power structure itself. And yet, questions were being asked. Not loudly, not everywhere, but persistently. The Cotton Kingdom, once seen as invincible, now cast long shadows. The stories of grandeur and gentility masked a system rotting at its core. Whispers of war grew louder. A reckoning was coming, and North Carolina would soon be forced to decide where it stood. What had been born in revolution and built on resistance was now threatened by the very foundation it had chosen to preserve. Slavery had brought wealth, but it had also brought division. It had made a few rich, but many bitter. And it had led the state, slowly and inexorably, toward a crisis from which there would be no turning back. The winds of war were rising, and in the years ahead, North Carolina would be called upon once again, not just to fight, but to decide who it truly was. Chapter 7: Civil War and the Confederate Carolinian. By the end of the 1850s, North Carolina stood at a crossroads. The soil was rich, the plantations profitable, and the coast bustling with trade. But beneath the surface, tension gripped the state. The Cotton Kingdom had brought prosperity to the eastern elite. But the mountains and backcountry told a different story. There, small farmers and poor laborers, many of whom owned no slaves at all, viewed the fiery talk of secession with suspicion. They were proud of their state, loyal to their homeland, but deeply uncertain about the path their leaders were rushing down. And so, when South Carolina seceded from the Union in December 1860, North Carolina hesitated. It did not follow immediately. It watched. In those early months of 1861, as the nation fractured and the drums of war began to beat louder, North Carolina tried to hold the center. There were loud voices calling for secession, especially among the planter class and in political halls. But there were just as many calling for caution. The state convened meetings and held debates. It rejected immediate secession in a statewide vote. Many North Carolinians believed that while they shared cultural and economic ties with the South, they had no desire to rush into conflict. But then came Fort Sumter, and then came Lincoln's call for troops. That, for many in North Carolina, was the breaking point. When President Lincoln requested that North Carolina send soldiers to help suppress the rebellion in South Carolina, it was seen not as a call for unity, but an act of aggression. On May 20th, 1861, exactly 85 years after the Mecklenburg Resolves had proclaimed independence from Britain, North Carolina passed its own ordinance of secession. With that, it joined the Confederate States of America, not as a firebrand, but as a state pushed to the edge. It was the last Southern state to secede, and for many of its people, the decision was heavy with dread. Once the die was cast, however, North Carolina committed itself to the Confederacy with grim determination. Over 125,000 of its men would serve in the Confederate military, more than any other Southern state. They fought in nearly every major battle of the war, from the blood-soaked fields of Antietam and Gettysburg to the drawn-out campaigns in Virginia and Tennessee. Tar Heel troops became known for their toughness and resilience, earning both respect and high casualties. At Gettysburg, they formed the backbone of Pickett's charge. In countless skirmishes and marches, they paid the price of loyalty in blood. Yet even as its soldiers fought and died for the Confederacy, the state itself was torn by contradictions. The eastern counties, dominated by plantation interests, remained deeply invested in the Confederate cause. But the western mountains were restless. There, where slavery was rare and Unionist sentiment had deeper roots, resistance simmered. Desertion rates were high, armed bands roamed the hills. Some were simply trying to survive. Others actively resisted Confederate authority. The mountains became a maze of hiding places for draft dodgers and Union sympathizers. Families were divided, churches split, and communities fractured by suspicion and vengeance. One of the most infamous symbols of internal resistance was the Heroes of America, a secret pro-Union society that operated across western North Carolina. Sometimes called the Red Strings, for the red yarn worn on their lapels, these men and women aided Union troops, helped escaped prisoners, and defied Confederate law. Their existence spoke to the uneasy truth that North Carolina, like the country itself, was not fighting a war with clean lines. It was a war of divided homes, whispered allegiances, and quiet defiance. The war took a brutal toll on the state. Cities like Wilmington, New Bern, and Plymouth became targets of Union offensives. In 1862, Union forces captured New Bern and held it for the remainder of the war. Wilmington, the last major Confederate port on the Atlantic coast, became a lifeline for the Southern war effort, smuggling in weapons and supplies from Europe through a network of blockade runners. Its fall in early 1865, after the bloody Battle of Fort Fisher, marked the death knell for the Confederacy's hopes. As the war dragged into its fourth year, North Carolina was exhausted. Fields lay fallow, railroads were shattered, inflation soared, families starved. The dead returned home in wooden boxes, or didn't return at all. And by the spring of 1865, the Confederate dream was collapsing. On April 9th, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. But in North Carolina, the war wasn't quite finished. Just 10 days later, one of the last major surrenders of the Civil War took place near Durham Station. There, Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston surrendered his army to Union General William Tecumseh Sherman at Bennett Place. It was the largest Confederate surrender of the war, involving nearly 90,000 troops across multiple states. And just like that, the guns went silent. But peace did not come easily. With the Confederacy defeated, North Carolina faced a new battle, one that would prove longer and in many ways more painful than the war itself. Reconstruction had arrived. The first months after the war were filled with uncertainty. The enslaved were now free, but freedom came without land, money, or protection. Thousands of formerly enslaved people fled plantations, sought out family members, and tried to build lives in a world that still saw them as less than human. Schools for black children opened, churches were built, and new communities emerged, acts of resilience and hope in the face of deep hostility. But the backlash was swift. The state's political structure was upended. Former Confederates were barred from office, and for the first time, black men were allowed to vote and hold public office. During this period, known as Radical Reconstruction, North Carolina elected black legislators, passed progressive reforms, and attempted to rewrite its future. But these gains were fragile. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan rose in response, using violence, intimidation, and murder to suppress black political participation and restore the old order. Tensions flared across the state. In counties like Alamance and Caswell, political assassinations and racial terror became common. Night riders burned schools, churches, and homes. Black leaders were lynched and their allies targeted. The federal government tried to intervene, sending troops and enacting enforcement laws. But progress came slowly, and often at a terrible cost. In 1868, North Carolina was readmitted to the Union after ratifying a new state constitution that extended civil rights and voting protections. But the battle for the soul of the state continued. By the mid-1870s, white Democrats, calling themselves Redeemers, had regained control of the state government. Through voter suppression, fraud, and intimidation, They dismantled Reconstruction's gains. Jim Crow laws followed, ushering in a new era of racial segregation and disenfranchisement. Still, something had shifted. The war had left scars too deep to hide. The myths of the antebellum South, the romantic plantations, the happy slaves, the invincible Confederacy, had been shattered. In their place stood graveyards, widows, and a generation of men maimed by bullets and disease. The war had tested the limits of loyalty, the meaning of freedom, and the cost of division. And though Reconstruction's promise was quickly buried under reactionary politics, it had planted seeds that would one day rise again. North Carolina emerged from the Civil War, battered but changed. Its economy lay in ruins. Its society was in turmoil. Its people were forced to confront uncomfortable truths about power, race, and identity. The myth of unity had been exposed as a lie. The lines between hero and traitor, between victim and oppressor, were blurred. But even in this wreckage, the state began to rebuild. Railroads were laid again. Industry slowly returned. Education reform, though unequal, began to take root. And the voices of the silenced, though pushed to the margins, did not disappear. They sang, they wrote, they organized. They remembered. The Confederate Carolinian was not one thing. He was the loyal soldier charging at Gettysburg. He was the farmer hiding his son from conscription officers. He was the enslaved man escaping through the swamps. He was the widow planting seeds in blood-soaked soil. He was the child born free for the first time. And she was the mother, teaching that child how to survive in a country still learning how to keep its promises. North Carolina, like the nation it belonged to, had been torn in two. And though the fighting had ended, the wounds would take far longer to heal. The war had ended the Confederacy, but it had not ended the conflict. That would rage on, in classrooms, in courtrooms, and in quiet acts of defiance for generations to come. And yet, from the ashes of rebellion and the weight of defeat, a new North Carolina would eventually rise. Different, fractured, but still standing. Still searching for its better angels, still wrestling with its past, and still marching, however slowly, toward something resembling justice. Chapter 8. From Tobacco to Textiles. The end of the Civil War had left North Carolina smoldering in more ways than one. Its fields had been trampled, its economy shattered, and its political institutions scrambled beyond recognition. But the fire had not consumed everything. In the quiet aftermath, as the state mourned its dead and reckoned with the ghosts of slavery and rebellion, new forces began to stir beneath the surface. Forces that would slowly reshape North Carolina from a war-torn, agrarian outpost into a modern industrial power. The scars of the past remained, but the promise of a different future began to flicker in factory smoke, railroad steam, and the pungent scent of cured tobacco leaves. The transformation was not immediate. For much of the 1870s, North Carolina remained a state suspended in recovery. The plantation economy, which had once dominated the East, was in collapse. Without enslaved labor, many landowners fell into debt. Their fortunes evaporated almost overnight. Tenant farming and sharecropping emerged as a stopgap solution, binding poor whites and newly freed black families alike into cycles of dependence and poverty. Cotton was still grown and tobacco still harvested, but the romantic vision of antebellum wealth was gone. In its place stood economic uncertainty and opportunity. The railroads came first. Like veins across a broken body, they began stitching the state back together. By connecting the isolated farms and towns of the Piedmont and Western Mountains to the coastal ports and national markets, the rails changed everything. Goods could move faster, cheaper, farther. Towns that had once been dusty crossroads became hubs of commerce. Hills that had been quiet for generations suddenly hummed with new life. And perhaps no place would be changed more dramatically than the heart of the state, Durham. Durham, little more than a whistle stop during the war, became the epicenter of a tobacco revolution. And at the center of Durham stood one name, Duke. Washington Duke had been a Confederate soldier and a small-time tobacco farmer. But after the war, he saw a new path forward, not in rows of crops, but in the curing barn and the factory floor. He and his sons began producing hand-rolled cigarettes, a novelty at the time, and selling them across the region. They embraced innovation, steam-powered machinery, standardized packaging, aggressive advertising. And in time, they didn't just sell more tobacco. They transformed how Americans smoked it. The rise of the Duke family mirrored the rise of the New South, a term coined by journalists and boosters who dreamed of a region no longer defined by slavery and stagnation, but by commerce, progress, and industrial power. The Dukes bought up competitors, built sprawling factories, and soon dominated the national tobacco market. By the 1890s, their American Tobacco Company controlled nearly 90% of all cigarette production in the United States. The Dukes became millionaires, and Durham became a city of smoke and ambition. But the tobacco boom didn't stand alone. It triggered other industries, other fortunes. The wooden crates used to ship cigarettes required carpenters. The machines needed parts and maintenance. Workers needed shoes, tools, housing. Entrepreneurs followed the scent of money, and Durham's skyline began to fill with chimneys, warehouses, and office towers. Still, the Duke story was more than a tale of factories and fortunes. The family, particularly James Buchanan Duke, known as Buck, channeled their wealth into something larger, a vision for Southern renewal. In 1924, Buck Duke created the Duke Endowment, a philanthropic foundation that would fund hospitals, orphanages, and most famously, a small Methodist college in Durham. That college would be renamed Duke University, and it would become one of the most prestigious institutions in the South, a monument to both ambition and legacy. While tobacco turned Durham into an industrial city, textiles were transforming the broader Piedmont region. Towns like Greensboro, High Point, Gastonia, and Kannapolis became synonymous with cloth and thread. The ingredients were simple: cotton from local farms, water from fast-flowing rivers to power mills, and cheap labor. Textile factories sprang up seemingly overnight, massive brick buildings filled with looms, spindles, and the deafening rhythm of production. Inside, men, women, and children worked long hours for meager pay, turning raw cotton into shirts, sheets, and uniforms. The textile boom created jobs, built cities, and laid the foundations of a middle class. It also brought with it new tensions. Factory life was harsh, and workers lived under strict rules, often in company-owned mill villages where rent was deducted from paychecks and dissent was unwelcome. Labor unions attempted to gain ground, but in a state still wary of outside influence and radicalism, they were met with fierce resistance. Strikes were broken, organizers jailed, and unrest quietly buried under the hum of machinery. Yet for many, even the hardships of mill life were preferable to the backbreaking uncertainty of farm labor. Rural families moved to town. Children grew up with the promise of wages. Churches, schools, and ballparks followed the mills. And a new kind of Southern identity emerged, neither planter aristocracy nor frontier subsistence, but working-class industrial pride. As industry grew, so did infrastructure. Rail lines crisscrossed the state, linking textile centers with tobacco warehouses and coastal ports. Banks and insurance companies sprouted to service this new economy. Newspapers flourished. Public schools slowly expanded, though segregation kept black and white children in separate and unequal systems. Cities grew taller, streets busier. North Carolina, once defined by its distance from the centers of power, was now building a power center of its own. The rise of furniture manufacturing added another pillar to this industrial resurgence. High Point, once a quiet stop along the railroad, became the furniture capital of the world. Factories produced chairs, tables, bed frames, and cabinets for customers across the country. Like textiles, furniture making was labor-intensive and required craftsmanship, but also machinery and organization. The region's forests supplied the timber, and the railroads shipped the finished goods. Trade shows and marketing campaigns followed, and High Point became not just a factory town, but a symbol of North Carolina's new identity: productive, proud, and modern. But not all North Carolinians shared equally in this progress. African Americans, while technically free and occasionally able to find work in urban industries, were systematically excluded from the prosperity. Jim Crow laws enforced strict segregation. Black workers were paid less, housed in worse conditions, and barred from most factory jobs. The opportunities of the New South were shaped by the color line, and while white mill workers may have struggled, their black counterparts faced a far steeper climb. Still, black communities endured and even thrived within the walls they were given. They built schools, founded businesses, published newspapers, and created vibrant cultural centers in cities like Raleigh, Charlotte, and Winston-Salem. Churches became centers of social life and political organizing. Teachers and preachers became community leaders. And even as violence and racism loomed, hope endured. Women, too, found themselves at the center of industrial life. They worked the looms, ran boarding houses, stitched tobacco pouches, and held their families together. Though often confined by rigid gender roles and paid less than men, they were the backbone of the mill towns. Their labor was essential. Their voices, though often quiet in the historical record, shaped the rhythm of life across the state. By the dawn of the 20th century, North Carolina had become a new kind of southern state. It was still rural, still deeply tied to agriculture, but its identity had shifted. The old plantation class had faded, replaced by industrialists, entrepreneurs, and managers. Tobacco, textiles, and furniture formed the economic triad that defined the era. Cities hummed with factories. Train whistles echoed through valleys. And a generation of North Carolinians grew up not in fields, but on factory floors. The New South had arrived. Not evenly, not fairly, but undeniably. The state was no longer a distant cousin to the commercial centers of the North. It was now a producer, a builder, a player. And though the seeds of future struggles were already being sown, labor unrest, racial inequality, environmental strain. For a time, the smoke rising from Durham's chimneys and the roar of High Point sawmills told a story of progress. North Carolina had reinvented itself, not by forgetting its past, but by building something new atop its ashes. The war was long over, but a different kind of battle had been won. A battle for relevance, for industry, and for a place in the modern American story. The state that once seceded in sorrow was now surging forward in steel and steam. The South had changed, and North Carolina, always a place of contrasts, had helped lead the way. Chapter 9. The Flight That Changed the World. By the turn of the 20th century, North Carolina had remade itself. Tobacco factories belched smoke into the skies above Durham. Textile mills hummed in Greensboro and Gastonia, and railroads stitched together once isolated communities. It was a state of labor and ambition, no longer defined solely by its past, but by what it was becoming. Still, few could have imagined that the sleepy dunes of its Outer Banks, a remote, wind-blasted sliver of land on the Atlantic edge, would become the site of a moment that would forever alter the course of human history. Yet it was there, at Kitty Hawk, in December of 1903. The two brothers from Ohio proved that flight was no longer the stuff of dreams and myth. And with that, North Carolina became the birthplace of aviation. Wilbur and Orville Wright were not from North Carolina. They weren't aristocrats or academics. They were bicycle mechanics from Dayton, Ohio. Practical men with grease under their fingernails and a restless curiosity in their minds. But their dreams were anything but ordinary. For years, the brothers had been obsessed with the idea of flight, not falling, not gliding, but true, powered, controlled flight. Others had tried and failed. Some had died in the process. But the Wrights believed that the key lay not just in wings or engines, but in control. How a pilot could guide a machine through the air like a rider steers a horse. Their quest brought them to North Carolina for one simple reason: wind. The Outer Banks were remote, yes, but they offered strong, steady breezes, soft sand for landings, and privacy far from the prying eyes of skeptics. Kitty Hawk was barely a village, a scattering of houses and a U.S. Weather Bureau station. Life there was harsh, the landscape wild and unforgiving. But the Wrights saw something else: the perfect proving ground. They arrived in 1900 with little fanfare, carrying with them gliders, notebooks, and quiet determination. The locals found them strange, but friendly. The brothers lived simply in a small wooden camp, braving swarms of mosquitoes, fierce storms, and the isolation of the dunes. They built their own wind tunnel to test wing shapes. They studied bird flight. They experimented tirelessly, crashing more times than they could count. But with every setback, they learned. By 1903, they had constructed their most ambitious machine yet, the Wright Flyer. Made of spruce and muslin, it looked more like a giant kite than a vehicle. A 12-horsepower engine powered twin propellers, and a set of bicycle chains transferred torque. It had no cockpit, no windshield, no instruments, but it had something no other machine had ever had: balance, propulsion, and control. The morning of December 17th was cold and clear. A brisk wind blew across the sand, and only a few men from the nearby life-saving station gathered to watch. Orville took the first turn. Lying belly down on the lower wing, he gripped the controls as Wilbur steadied the plane. At 10:35 a.m., the Flyer lifted off the rail and rose into the air. It lasted 12 seconds. 12 seconds. 120 feet. Barely enough time to shout a sentence. But in that instant, everything changed. Humanity had defied gravity, not as a balloon drifting with the wind, but as a machine controlled by a pilot. The Wrights made 3 more flights that day, each one longer and higher. The final flight, piloted by Wilbur, lasted 59 seconds and traveled 852 feet. Then a gust of wind flipped the flyer and damaged it beyond immediate repair. But it didn't matter. They had done it. News of the achievement spread slowly at first. Many newspapers dismissed the reports as fantasy. But those who had witnessed it knew better. The Wrights returned to Ohio, continued refining their design, and by 1905 were flying machines for miles at a time. Eventually, the world caught up. And when it did, the name Kitty Hawk was etched forever into the story of the modern age. North Carolina, once the site of colonial mystery and Civil War devastation, now claimed a new kind of legacy. It was the place where humans first flew. The Wright brothers themselves remained modest. They were inventors, not showmen. But the implications of what they had achieved began to ripple outward almost immediately. The dream of flight had haunted mankind for centuries, from Daedalus and Icarus to Leonardo da Vinci's sketches. But now it was real. Military leaders, scientists, adventurers, and entrepreneurs all took notice. And as flight technology evolved, so too did the world. By World War I, airplanes were no longer novelties. They were weapons. Bombers and scouts flew across European skies, reshaping the nature of warfare. In the 1920s and 30s, aviation took on a romantic sheen. Charles Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic, Amelia Earhart captivated imaginations, and commercial air travel, still expensive and rare, began connecting cities once weeks apart by train. The jet age was still decades away, but the trajectory had been set and it pointed skyward. For North Carolina, the Wright brothers' success became more than a historical footnote. It became a point of pride, woven into the state's identity. First in flight was stamped on license plates, taught in schools, and celebrated in museums. In 1927, a monument was erected atop Kill Devil Hill to commemorate the feat. And each year, tourists came to walk the same sandy stretch where 2 quiet brothers had made history. But the legacy of the Wright Flyer was more than just technological. It symbolized a new way of thinking, an audacity to imagine, to build, to test, and to fail, until something impossible became real. In many ways, it echoed North Carolina's own story. A state once fractured by slavery, battered by war, and bound to the rhythms of tobacco and cotton had chosen to evolve. It embraced industry, education, and innovation. It looked beyond the past, even as it carried its weight and turned towards something higher. The transformation of the early 20th century was not limited to flight alone. The same winds that lifted the Flyer carried with them a spirit of change. Education reform gained momentum, with new schools and colleges opening across the state. Roads improved. Electricity reached rural areas. Cities like Charlotte and Raleigh expanded, their skylines rising just as the airplanes did. Aviation became part of the economic engine. Military bases, research centers, and airports followed. North Carolina was no longer on the periphery. It was now plugged into a national and global system, its roots grounded, but its gaze lifted toward the sky. Even today, the legacy of that flight endures. Every jet that arcs over the Atlantic, every spacecraft that leaves Earth's atmosphere, carries in it a trace of Kitty Hawk. Every engineer designing a drone or building a satellite is part of the same lineage. And North Carolina, with its red clay and sea-blown dunes, still holds the honor of having hosted the moment when gravity lost its monopoly on motion. The Wright brothers didn't just invent a machine. They unlocked a dimension. And they did it not in a laboratory or a marble hall, but on a windswept beach using wood, canvas, and curiosity. In doing so, they tied a small southern state to the great unfolding story of global progress. For North Carolina, that morning in 1903 marked more than a technological breakthrough. It was a spiritual pivot. From the ancient myths of lost colonies to the hard truths of slavery and war. From the tobacco-stained fingers of mill workers to the whir of spinning looms, the state had carried many identities. But now, it had given the world wings. The state that once turned inward during secession had now pointed humanity outward, toward the clouds, toward possibility, and toward a future no longer tethered to the ground. That first flight may have lasted only seconds, but it lifted the world into a new century. And it all began in the sand under a pale blue sky in North Carolina. Chapter 10: Segregation, Struggle, and the Rise of Jim Crow. As North Carolina stepped into the 20th century, its people looked to the skies with pride. The success of the Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk had tied the state to the promise of flight and progress. Factories were humming. Railroads were stretching across the land like steel arteries. Tobacco and textiles brought economic power to cities that had once been little more than crossroads. But while North Carolina was being celebrated as part of a new South, modern and industrious, another story was unfolding, one far darker, one buried beneath the polished surface of progress. It was a story of betrayal, violence, and systemic erasure. For while one part of the state soared toward the future, another was tightening the chains of the past. This was the age of segregation. This was the rise of Jim Crow. The promise of emancipation and later reconstruction had lit a brief and fragile flame of hope for African Americans in North Carolina. Following the Civil War, formerly enslaved men and women built schools, churches, businesses, and newspapers. They organized, voted, and even held public office. Towns like Wilmington, New Bern, and Raleigh saw the emergence of a black middle class, teachers, doctors, merchants, ministers, who carved out lives for themselves in a country that had only recently acknowledged their humanity. But that progress came under constant attack. When Reconstruction collapsed in the 1870s, it left a dangerous void. White Southern Democrats, calling themselves Redeemers, moved quickly to reclaim power. They argued that the South had been humiliated by federal interference and black rule, and they vowed to restore what they called order. What followed was a carefully orchestrated campaign of racial violence, legal discrimination, and political suppression. It did not come all at once. It came in waves. It came in laws. It came in silence. At the heart of this system was disenfranchisement. For democracy to function, citizens must vote. But that right was methodically stripped from black North Carolinians in the decades after Reconstruction. Poll taxes, literacy tests, and understanding clauses were introduced, all designed to appear race-neutral while devastating black turnout. White registrars had broad discretion to determine who could vote and who could not. Grandfather clauses ensured poor white men could bypass these requirements, while black citizens were left voiceless. By the turn of the century, black political power had been almost entirely erased. But this erasure was not just political. It was physical. It was violent. And nowhere was this more brutally demonstrated than in Wilmington in 1898. Wilmington was, at the time, North Carolina's largest city. It was a bustling port town with a thriving black community. Nearly two-thirds of its residents were African American. Black citizens owned newspapers, ran successful businesses, and held elected positions on the city council and board of aldermen. The city was a symbol of what post-Reconstruction North Carolina could be: diverse, cooperative, and economically strong. But to white supremacists, Wilmington was something else entirely: a threat. In the lead-up to the 1898 election, a coalition of white Democrats, backed by newspapers and wealthy business interests, launched a campaign of fear and intimidation. They spoke of Negro domination, using every racist trope they could conjure to stoke resentment among white voters. One of their primary targets was the Daily Record, Wilmington's black-owned newspaper, which had published an editorial criticizing white hypocrisy and violence against black women. That article, written by editor Alexander Manley, became a rallying cry for white extremists. On November 10th, just days after the state elections, a mob of over 1,500 white men descended on Wilmington. Armed with rifles and torches, they stormed the city. They burned the Daily Record to the ground. They marched through black neighborhoods, murdering black citizens in cold blood. Some victims were shot in the back as they fled. Others were hunted down and executed. The exact death toll remains unknown. Estimates range from dozens to hundreds. But what is certain is this: it was a massacre. In the aftermath, the mob forcibly removed the city's elected officials, many of them black or fusionist whites, and installed their own replacements. This was not a riot. It was not a protest. It was a coup d'etat, the only successful violent overthrow of a local American government in the nation's history. And it worked. There were no federal investigations, no military interventions, no trials. The perpetrators went unpunished. Some became state and national politicians. The message was clear: black progress would not be tolerated. And Wilmington was only the beginning. What followed was the formalization of racial apartheid in North Carolina. Laws were passed to segregate public transportation, schools, restaurants, theaters, and even cemeteries. Black citizens were forced to sit in separate train cars, use separate water fountains, and attend underfunded schools. They were expected to step off sidewalks for white pedestrians, to never challenge a white man in court, and to accept the lie that they were inferior. These laws, collectively known as Jim Crow, were not just about separation. They were about control. They were about reminding black North Carolinians every day, in every space, that they were no longer free in any meaningful sense of the word. Violence underpinned the entire system. Lynchings were used as a tool of terror. Between the 1880s and 1930s, dozens of black men were hanged from trees, light poles, and bridges across the state. Often accused of crimes without evidence, often killed in front of cheering crowds. No trials, no juries, just death. These spectacles were designed not just to punish individuals, but to traumatize entire communities. The message was as unmistakable as it was horrifying: stay in your place. And yet, through it all, black North Carolinians endured. They resisted. They built. They taught their children to read in crowded classrooms with secondhand books. They opened churches that doubled as community centers and political hubs. They created their own businesses, their own social clubs, their own colleges. Institutions like Shaw University, founded in Raleigh in 1865, became beacons of education and dignity. In the face of state-sanctioned hatred, they held their heads high and carried on. In white communities, the rise of Jim Crow was often justified as a return to normalcy. Politicians spoke of maintaining peace and order. But the peace they spoke of was one enforced by fear. The order was one that demanded silence from the oppressed. The same men who had marched through Wilmington with rifles would later be hailed as redeemers and civic leaders. History, for decades, was written by the victors. School textbooks omitted the massacre. Newspapers ignored the lynchings, and monuments were built not to the victims, but to the Confederate dead. Still, cracks began to appear. Some white North Carolinians, journalists, reformers, ministers, quietly questioned the morality of the system. A few spoke louder, but progress was slow, and the weight of Jim Crow bore down for generations. It would not be until the mid-20th century that the civil rights movement would rise to challenge the edifice of segregation in earnest. That battle, too, would be long and bloody. But Wilmington remained a wound. For nearly a century, the massacre was erased from public memory. Survivors feared speaking of it. Schools did not teach it. And the city itself, rebuilt and polished, offered no markers to acknowledge what had happened there. It wasn't until the late 20th century that a serious effort was made to unearth the truth. A state commission was eventually formed. Testimonies were collected. Documents were uncovered. And slowly, painfully, the silence began to break. Today, the story of Wilmington is no longer hidden, but neither is it fully healed. The echoes of that violence, of the stolen votes, the broken bodies, the burned presses, still shape the social and political landscape of North Carolina. The legacy of Jim Crow lives on in disparities in education, housing, and justice. But so too does the legacy of resistance. The churches that stood firm, the teachers who inspired, the families who endured. North Carolina's story is not a straight line. It is a tangle of hope and heartbreak, of progress and backlash. The same state that lifted humanity into the sky at Kitty Hawk once silenced its own citizens at the barrel of a gun in Wilmington. To understand North Carolina is to hold both truths at once, to recognize that history is not just about the moments we celebrate, but also about the ones we tried to forget. The age of segregation built barriers. It enforced silence, but it could not erase the truth forever. And as the 20th century wore on, a new generation would rise, ready to challenge the world Jim Crow had built and determined to build something better in its place. The struggle was far from over, but the silence had been broken, and history, once suppressed, began to speak. Chapter 11. World Wars and the Spirit of Service. The dawn of the 20th century had already reshaped North Carolina in countless ways. From the machine hum of Durham's tobacco factories to the hiss of steam trains rolling through the Piedmont, the state was no longer a rural backwater. Industry thrived, cities grew, and the wounds of the Civil War and Reconstruction, though still aching, were slowly scabbing over. But just as North Carolina was settling into its new identity, modern, industrial, cautious but proud, the outside world called again. And this time, the call came from far beyond the borders of Dixie or even the nation. The world was at war, and North Carolina would answer. When the First World War erupted in Europe in 1914, many Americans saw it as a distant thunderstorm. Dangerous, yes, but far away. The United States remained neutral for years, watching as empires clashed and trenches stretched across France like festering wounds. But neutrality could not hold forever. By 1917, after a series of provocations, including the sinking of American ships and the infamous Zimmerman telegram. President Woodrow Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war. The Great War had become America's war, and with it, North Carolina's. The response was swift. More than 86,000 North Carolinians would serve in the armed forces during World War I. From mountain boys in patched uniforms to textile workers turned doughboys. Many had never been beyond their county lines. Now they were sailing across oceans, carrying rifles and fear into foreign soil. They fought in the mud of the Meuse-Argonne, the shattered forests of Belleau Wood, the frozen trenches of the Western Front. Some returned home as heroes. Others never returned at all. But the war effort wasn't confined to the battlefield. North Carolina itself became a training ground. Camp Greene in Charlotte, Camp Bragg near Fayetteville, and Camp Polk in Raleigh filled with thousands of new recruits. Farmers sold their crops to feed the troops. Women joined the Red Cross, rolled bandages, and rationed flour and sugar. Children collected scrap metal. Factories retooled for military production. The entire state was mobilized, not just for war, but for something larger, something that felt like a national mission. For Black North Carolinians, the war brought a complex mix of hope and heartbreak. Nearly 20,000 served in uniform, most in segregated units. They dug trenches, unloaded ships, and served with distinction in combat units like the 92nd and 93rd Infantry Divisions. At home, Black communities rallied to support the war, believing, hoping, that patriotic service might help dismantle the walls of Jim Crow. But when the war ended in 1918, the promises were broken. Returning Black soldiers faced hostility, discrimination, and even violence. Their uniforms, instead of symbols of honor, were seen by many as threats, and the gains they had imagined were once again deferred. Still, the war had changed something. North Carolina was no longer a state standing apart from the world. It had helped shape it, and in turn, was shaped by it. The military presence remained. Camp Bragg, renamed Fort Bragg, would grow into one of the largest military installations in the country. Veterans came home with broader views, new skills, and ambitions beyond the farm or mill. And while the 1920s brought economic boom, they also brought a sense that the world had become smaller, faster, more connected. Then came the 1930s and the collapse. The Great Depression hit North Carolina hard. Textile mills closed, tobacco prices plummeted, unemployment soared. Families who had scraped their way into the middle class slid back into poverty. But even in despair, the memory of service endured. And when a second, far more brutal war began to brew across the Atlantic and in the Pacific, North Carolina once again felt the pull of duty. World War II began in Europe in 1939, but for Americans, it officially began on December 7th, 1941, the day Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor. Within hours, the country was at war, and within days, North Carolina was mobilizing. The numbers were staggering. More than 360,000 North Carolinians would serve in World War II, the highest of any southern state except Texas. They joined every branch: Army, Navy, Marines, Army Air Forces. They stormed the beaches of Normandy, froze in the forests of the Ardennes, fought through the jungles of the Pacific, flew bombing runs over Berlin and Tokyo. They carried the legacy of their fathers from World War I and built on it with ferocity and courage. Back home, the state was transformed. War plants opened in Raleigh and Asheville. Shipyards boomed in Wilmington, where thousands built Liberty ships to carry troops and cargo. The city, once best known for the massacre of 1898, now stood as a pillar of wartime production. Farmers increased yields. Textile factories worked around the clock, making uniforms, blankets, and parachutes. Women entered the workforce in record numbers, filling jobs in welding, manufacturing, and administration. Rosie the Riveter was no longer just a poster. She was a neighbor, a daughter, a sister. Fort Bragg, Camp Lejeune, Seymour Johnson Field, and other military bases swelled with activity. Soldiers drilled on pine-covered fields. Paratroopers learned to jump into enemy territory. Pilots trained in the skies above Goldsboro. The war turned North Carolina into a military corridor, one that would remain long after the guns fell silent. The war also shifted the state's social fabric. Black North Carolinians, once relegated to the margins, served in larger numbers and with greater visibility. The Tuskegee Airmen trained and fought with distinction. Black workers in Wilmington's shipyards and Charlotte's factories proved indispensable. At home, black citizens pushed for fairer treatment, better pay, and greater access to education and opportunity. The Double V campaign, Victory Abroad and Victory at Home, gained traction. And though segregation remained the law, the moral weight of the war began to crack the foundations of white supremacy. Japanese internment also touched North Carolina. At Montreat, near Asheville, a detainment center housed Japanese nationals and Japanese Americans. Though smaller than the camps out west, it stood as a reminder that even in wartime unity, fear could override justice. As the war ground on, letters flowed back from overseas, some filled with love and longing, others with sorrow. The state's war dead numbered in the thousands, their names etched into courthouses, plaques, and gravestones across the state. Families hung gold stars in their windows. Communities mourned and waited. And when the war finally ended in 1945, with the mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the surrender of Germany and Japan, North Carolina breathed a collective sigh of relief, but also stood forever changed. Victory brought celebration, but also questions. Returning veterans demanded more than parades. They wanted education, jobs, homes. The GI Bill opened doors that had long been shut. Colleges swelled with new students. Suburbs began to sprawl outside cities like Charlotte and Raleigh. Highways were built. Industry expanded. North Carolina moved into the post-war era with momentum and confidence. Yet the contradictions remained. Black veterans who had fought fascism abroad returned to face racism at home. They wore their medals, but were denied service in restaurants. They had defended democracy, but were still denied the vote. Their children, born into segregated schools, would carry the fight into the next generation. But the spirit of service endured. It became something more than military. It became civic. North Carolinians had fought in 2 world wars, had built ships and trained soldiers, had sacrificed sons and daughters for causes greater than themselves. That sense of duty, whether on the battlefield or the factory floor, became a permanent part of the state's identity. It was a spirit passed down in stories at kitchen tables, in framed photographs on mantels, in the names of VFW halls and high school football stadiums. It was worn in uniforms, remembered on Memorial Day, and taught in classrooms. And though the wars had ended, the service had not. In the decades that followed, North Carolina would send its sons and daughters into conflicts in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Fort Bragg would become home to the 82nd Airborne Division. Camp Lejeune would grow into a pillar of the U.S. Marine Corps. The state's military footprint would become one of the largest in the nation. And behind every deployment, every mission, stood communities that remembered what it meant to serve. The two world wars did more than pull North Carolina into global affairs. They accelerated its transformation from rural to urban, from agricultural to industrial, from isolation to engagement. They revealed the state's strengths and its fractures. They offered a glimpse of what unity could achieve and what sacrifice it demanded. Above all, they proved that North Carolina, though scarred by division and inequality, could rise to meet the challenges of history. It had done so not once, but twice. In mud-filled trenches and jungle-covered islands, in shipyards and textile mills. The Tar Heel spirit was no longer confined to the state's borders. It had crossed oceans. It had helped liberate continents. And as peace returned, that spirit of service, of duty, of perseverance remained, quietly anchoring a state still in search of its full promise. Chapter 12. The Civil Rights Movement in the Carolinas. When the guns of World War II finally fell silent and the soldiers came home, North Carolina stood at a pivotal point in its history. Its people had sacrificed for democracy abroad, on battlefields from Normandy to the Pacific. But at home, democracy remained incomplete. Jim Crow still loomed over every street, courtroom, and classroom. The scars of segregation ran deep, and black North Carolinians returned from war to find the same barriers they had left behind. Poll taxes, unequal schools, separate waiting rooms, and the silent, constant threat of racial violence. But the spirit of service that had fueled the war effort did not disappear. It transformed. A new generation had seen the world, fought for its freedom, and was no longer willing to accept a second-class place within it. And in North Carolina, that fire would ignite a movement. The struggle for civil rights in the Carolinas did not begin with a single event or a famous speech. It began in living rooms and churches, in whispered conversations and bold prayers. It began when black parents demanded equal textbooks for their children, when veterans refused to sit at the back of buses, when communities organized voter drives in the face of intimidation. And then, on February 1st, 1960, 4 young men walked into a Woolworths in downtown Greensboro and sat down at a whites-only lunch counter. They were college students, fresh-faced, polite, and determined. Ezell Blair Jr., David Richmond, Franklin McCain, and Joseph McNeil were freshmen at North Carolina A and T State University. Inspired by the teachings of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and tired of waiting for change, they decided to act. They purchased small items from another part of the store, sat at the counter, and asked for coffee. The waitress refused. A manager demanded they leave. They remained seated, silent and firm, until the store closed. The next day, they returned, with more students. And the day after that, more came still. Within a week, the sit-in movement had spread to other cities across North Carolina. Winston-Salem, Durham, Charlotte, and soon across the South. By spring, more than 50,000 students had participated in sit-ins across the country. The Greensboro Four, as they came to be known, had sparked a national firestorm by doing something deceptively simple: sitting down. The sit-ins were peaceful, but they were not passive. Protesters were trained to endure humiliation without reacting, to remain calm when spat on, slapped, or screamed at. They were jailed by the dozens, dragged from counters and thrown into cells. Yet they kept coming, wave after wave, until business owners realized that their refusal to serve black customers was no longer sustainable. The Woolworths in Greensboro officially desegregated its lunch counter in July 1960. The students had won that battle. But the war for equality was far from over. While the sit-ins were electrifying, they were only one part of a much broader campaign for civil rights taking shape across the state. Black leaders, educators, ministers, and ordinary citizens had been laying the groundwork for years, often at great personal risk. NAACP chapters organized legal challenges. Ministers formed councils and coalitions. Teachers used their classrooms not just to educate, but to empower. One of the most critical arenas of this struggle was the fight for educational equality. In 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling in Brown v. Board of Education declared that segregated schools were inherently unequal and thus unconstitutional. But in North Carolina, as in much of the South, the response was slow and resistant. State leaders introduced what became known as the Pupil Assignment Plan, a legal smokescreen that allowed school boards to delay meaningful integration by placing the burden of change on individual families. On paper, the law allowed black students to apply to white schools. In practice, it did everything possible to prevent them from doing so. The first real test came in 1957, when 4 black students were admitted to Charlotte's previously all-white schools. They were met with hostility, taunts, and threats. Teachers ignored them. White classmates harassed them. Yet they endured. More students followed in Greensboro, Durham, and Raleigh. The process was painfully slow. 10 years after Brown, fewer than 5% of black students in North Carolina attended integrated schools. But those who walked through the doors did so with courage that would change the state forever. Behind them stood families, churches, and communities that supported their struggle. And in the face of white resistance, some of it violent, some institutional, black activists in North Carolina kept organizing. The 1960s brought marches, boycotts, voter registration drives, and mass meetings. Leaders like Golden Frinks, a fiery NAACP field secretary from Edmonton, led demonstrations in small towns throughout eastern North Carolina, often confronting police dogs and fire hoses. He, along with countless others, understood that change would not come from Washington alone. It had to be fought for in every city council chamber and county courthouse. The battle for voting rights was particularly fierce. In many rural counties, black citizens still faced impossible hurdles: literacy tests, impossible understanding clauses, and open intimidation. Registering to vote meant risking your job, your home, even your life. But activists persisted. Some formed citizenship schools to help people pass the tests. Others organized caravans to transport voters to registration offices and groups for safety. Slowly, painfully, the voter rolls began to grow. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were federal victories, but their power was only as strong as local enforcement. In North Carolina, some officials grudgingly complied. Others found new ways to obstruct. Redistricting, gerrymandering, and economic pressure replaced old forms of exclusion. But the momentum had shifted. Black Carolinians were no longer willing to wait. Even in the face of backlash, change came. By the late 1960s, school integration had begun to accelerate. In Charlotte, a federal court ruling in Swan versus Charlotte-Mecklenburg Board of Education upheld the use of busing to achieve desegregation, setting a national precedent. The decision was controversial and sparked protests from white parents, but it stood. Charlotte became a model, imperfect but bold, of how integration could work in practice. Across the state, young people continued to lead. College campuses became centers of activism. At North Carolina's Central, A&T, and other historically black colleges and universities, students organized rallies, walkouts, and voter registration drives. They refused to be passive recipients of justice. They demanded it. But progress came with pain. There were bomb threats, beatings, arson attacks. In some towns, civil rights leaders were jailed or run out of business. In others, they were shot. The weight of resistance was heavy, but the resolve was heavier. The movement also forced white North Carolinians to confront their own beliefs. Some joined the struggle: clergy, professors, young activists. Others clung to segregation, couching their views in talk of tradition or community values. And many simply looked away, uncomfortable with the changes, but unsure how or whether to oppose them. Yet even among the hesitant, something shifted. Children who had once sat in all-white classrooms now had black classmates. Businesses that had once refused service quietly changed their policies. Cities that had once ignored the demands of protest began appointing black leaders, opening hiring, and funding integrated programs. By the end of the 1970s, North Carolina looked different. Not perfect, far from it, but changed. The Jim Crow laws had been dismantled. Schools were legally integrated, though inequalities remained. Black citizens held office in city halls and state legislatures. The legacy of the movement was visible not just in laws, but in lives. The Greensboro Four had become national icons. Their quiet sit-down had become a symbol of courage and conviction, taught in history books, remembered in monuments. The Woolworths, where it began, was transformed into the International Civil Rights Center and Museum, a place not just of memory, but of education. But the deeper legacy of the movement lives in those who never made headlines, the teachers who held on through years of threats, the parents who marched with their children in hand, the pastors who opened their sanctuaries, the students who risked everything to sit, to walk, to vote. Their names may not be carved in stone, but their actions reshaped North Carolina and the nation. The civil rights movement in the Carolinas was never a singular event. It was a chorus, sometimes loud, sometimes barely audible, but always moving forward. It was fought in bus terminals, in school board meetings, in courthouses and cotton fields, on front porches and downtown streets. It was the unfinished business of emancipation, carried by a new generation unwilling to wait another 100 years. In the end, the movement didn't just change laws, it changed hearts. It changed the very idea of what North Carolina could be. And it left behind a promise that no matter how long the road, no matter how steep the climb, justice moves forward. Always. Chapter 13. Banking Giants and the Research Triangle. By the time the civil rights movement began to settle into the history books and a new generation looked ahead to the promises of the late 20th century, North Carolina had already begun reinventing itself once again. It had been a state of tobacco fields and cotton mills, of segregation and struggle, of flight and fire and defiant change. But as the 1980s and 90s approached, North Carolina was transforming into something few had predicted, a nerve center of the modern global economy. This transformation did not come overnight. It came from decades of ambition, strategy, and bold decisions made by those who saw potential in the red clay hills and longleaf pines. They didn't just dream of progress. They planned for it, and they built it, tower by tower, lab by lab, university by university. This is the story of how North Carolina became a global leader in finance, tech, and education, and how two very different forces, the rise of banking in Charlotte and the creation of the Research Triangle, reshaped the identity of an entire state. The roots of North Carolina's banking boom stretch back to a time when Charlotte was still considered a modest southern city, better known for cotton processing than corporate ambition. But in the aftermath of World War II, Charlotte's business leaders saw an opportunity. As the South modernized and diversified, the city positioned itself as a regional hub of commerce and finance. And at the center of that transformation stood a single institution that would come to define the city's economic trajectory: Nations Bank. Nations Bank's predecessor institutions, beginning with the Commercial National Bank of Charlotte in 1874, had grown steadily over the years, merging with smaller banks, expanding services, and weathering the storms of war, depression, and political upheaval. But it wasn't until the late 20th century that their ambitions truly exploded onto the national stage. Under the leadership of Hugh McColl Jr., Nations Bank embarked on an aggressive expansion strategy during the 1980s and 90s, acquiring banks across the country and steadily climbing the ranks of American finance. In 1998, the game changed forever. Nations Bank merged with San Francisco-based Bank America Corporation in what was then the largest bank merger in U.S. history. The newly formed Bank of America, with its headquarters in Charlotte, became the first coast-to-coast banking giant in the country. The city, once viewed as a sleepy provincial capital, was now the beating heart of a financial empire. Skyscrapers rose. Global headquarters took root, and Charlotte became the second largest banking center in the United States, trailing only New York. But Charlotte's rise wasn't just about mergers and glass towers. It was about timing, strategy, and geography. The city's location placed it within reach of major southern markets. Its business-friendly environment attracted investors and talent. And as traditional industries like tobacco and textiles declined, finance became the foundation of a new southern economy. Cleaner, faster, and far more global. The banking boom brought with it jobs, wealth, and influence. It also reshaped the skyline, culture, and political clout of North Carolina. International firms moved in, law offices expanded, real estate boomed. Charlotte became not just a city of banks, but a city of ambition. And through it all, Bank of America stood as both symbol and engine of the state's economic evolution. But Charlotte was only one piece of the puzzle. 200 miles to the northeast, another kind of transformation was underway, one that would redefine the very idea of what a southern state could be. This time, the story began not with skyscrapers, but with science, and with 3 universities. In the 1950s, North Carolina was still reeling from the effects of war and economic upheaval. Many of its best and brightest students left the state for opportunities elsewhere. Faculty and researchers followed. The universities, Duke in Durham, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and North Carolina State University in Raleigh, were respected, but they struggled to retain top talent. Brain drain was a real and growing problem. But in the minds of a few visionary leaders, the solution was obvious. If the state could not keep its talent, it would build a place so compelling, so advanced, that no one would want to leave. Thus was born the idea of Research Triangle Park. Located on 7,000 acres of pine forest between Raleigh and Durham, the park was envisioned as a collaborative space where private industry and academic research could flourish side by side. It was not a city or a campus, but something entirely new. A research park that would harness the intellectual power of the Triangle's three major universities and turn it into economic firepower. At first, the vision seemed wildly optimistic. Few companies wanted to relocate to what was still viewed as a rural state with a deeply conservative social structure. But the visionaries persisted. They promoted the park across the country, pitched its potential, and emphasized the low cost of living, quality of life, and access to academic institutions. Slowly, companies began to come. The breakthrough came in the 1960s, when IBM announced plans to open a major facility in the park. The move sent a signal to the rest of the nation. The Research Triangle was real. Other tech firms and pharmaceutical giants soon followed. Glaxo, Cisco, RTI International, and dozens more established research centers in the park. Laboratories, office buildings, and data centers began to emerge from the forest. By the 1980s and 90s, Research Triangle Park had become one of the most prominent high-tech research centers in the world. It was no longer just a bold experiment. It was a magnet for talent, a launchpad for innovation, and a cornerstone of North Carolina's economic identity. The success of RTP, combined with the rise of Charlotte's financial empire, meant that by the turn of the 21st century, North Carolina had managed to do something few southern states had accomplished. It had pivoted from an agricultural and manufacturing past to a future built on knowledge, capital, and connectivity. And it had done so by embracing not just corporate growth, but education. The universities that had once worried about losing their scholars now became engines of the economy. UNC Chapel Hill advanced in medical research and public health. Duke became a powerhouse in biomedical sciences and global policy. North Carolina State pushed boundaries in engineering and computer science. Startups emerged from dorm rooms. Tech companies recruited from classrooms. Professors became entrepreneurs. The lines between academia and industry blurred, and the entire region benefited. Together, the Research Triangle and Charlotte created a 1-2 punch of economic dynamism that pushed North Carolina onto the global stage. The state began to attract not just national attention, but international investment. Multinational corporations opened headquarters. Venture capital flowed into Raleigh-Durham. Charlotte hosted the Democratic National Convention in 2012, a symbolic nod to its emergence as a political and financial player. But success brought challenges. Growth meant rising housing costs, traffic congestion, and growing inequality. Tech and finance jobs offered high salaries and opportunities, but not everyone could access them. Rural areas, especially in eastern North Carolina, continued to struggle. The gap between booming urban centers and stagnant small towns grew wider, and questions about the state's identity began to re-emerge. Was North Carolina still Southern? Was it progressive or conservative? Who was benefiting from this transformation, and who was being left behind? Even as these questions swirled, the momentum of innovation continued. The state invested in broadband infrastructure, community colleges, and STEM education. Biotech firms expanded. Clean energy startups emerged. Charlotte's skyline grew denser. Raleigh's downtown buzzed with restaurants and software firms. Durham rebranded its tobacco warehouses into art galleries, incubators, and lofts. And throughout it all, the spirit of collaboration, the very ethos that had birthed the Research Triangle, remained at the heart of the state's success. Government, business, and academia worked in tandem. Innovation was not hoarded, but shared. The same state that once sent soldiers to Civil War battlefields now sent satellites into space and algorithms into financial markets. Banking giants, research parks, global universities. The story of North Carolina in the late 20th century was no longer a tale of cotton or tobacco. It was a story of bold reinvention. A state that had once been defined by what it lacked, wealth, power, progress, had become a model for how to build a future out of collaboration and ambition. And yet, as the 21st century accelerated, one question remained. Could North Carolina continue to grow without losing its soul? Could it balance innovation with inclusion, prosperity with equity, growth with grace? That question, like the future itself, remained unanswered. But if the past was any indication, North Carolina would not wait for history to happen. It would build it. One idea, one partnership, one transformation at a time. Chapter 14. Sports, Music, and Culture. As North Carolina marched into the modern age, its economy transformed by research labs, finance towers, and high-tech innovation, something older and more enduring remained at the heart of the state's character. Beyond the spreadsheets and startup pitches, beyond the glint of banking headquarters or the silent hum of supercomputers, there was still something raw, real, and deeply rooted that made North Carolina unmistakably itself. It wasn't just the geography or the politics or even the history. It was a spirit, a culture that had evolved over generations, shaped by hardship, celebration, faith, food, and fierce loyalty. It was the Tar Heel identity, and it was alive in every pickup game on a schoolyard court, every banjo echo in a Blue Ridge holler, every smoky bite of pulled pork, and every quiet sip of something that came out of a mason jar in the back of a shed. To understand North Carolina is to understand its obsessions, and none burns brighter than basketball. College basketball in North Carolina isn't a pastime, it's religion. And the cathedral? The stretch of Highway 15501 that connects Durham to Chapel Hill. Just 8 miles apart, Duke University and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill have waged one of the fiercest, most storied rivalries in all of American sports. Every time the Tar Heels face the Blue Devils, it's not just a game. It's a civil war played in squeaky sneakers and buzzer beaters. Legends were made on these hardwood courts. Names like Dean Smith, Mike Krzyzewski, Christian Lettner, James Worthy, and Vince Carter are etched into national memory. But none cast a shadow quite like Michael Jordan. Born in Brooklyn but raised in Wilmington, Jordan became a Tar Heel at UNC under Coach Smith, hitting the game-winning shot in the 1982 NCAA championship as a freshman. It was the beginning of an ascent that would take him to the NBA, Olympic gold, and international stardom. But no matter how high he flew, Jordan never drifted far from his roots. He carried North Carolina with him in his style, his fire, and his loyalty. To this day, you can walk into a gym anywhere in the state and find kids wearing Carolina blue jerseys with a number 23 stitched on the back, still dreaming of greatness. But basketball is only one part of the state's cultural bloodstream. North Carolina lives in its music too, rhythms and melodies that trace back through centuries. In the hollows of the Appalachian Mountains, music was a kind of inheritance. passed down not through conservatories, but through calloused fingers and tinny strings. Fiddles, banjos, dulcimers, and upright basses came together on front porches and barn stages to create the sound now known around the world as bluegrass. It was raw and fast, a mix of Irish reels, African rhythms, and Appalachian soul. And while bluegrass found global fame through artists like Bill Monroe and Flatt and Scruggs, many of its deepest roots were planted right here. In places like Boone and Wilkesboro, festivals still light up the hills, and young players learn the old songs the same way their grandparents did, by ear, by heart, by firelight. But the music of North Carolina doesn't stay in one key. Out east, you can hear gospel pouring from church doors on Sunday mornings, voices rising in unison. In the Piedmont, the blues once rumbled through tobacco towns. And in cities like Charlotte and Raleigh today, hip-hop and indie rock shake the walls of downtown venues. Artists like J. Cole, born in Fayetteville, have brought the voice of modern North Carolina into headphones around the world, telling stories of race, struggle, and Southern pride with lyrical precision. Still, no conversation about Tar Heel culture is complete without discussing food. And in North Carolina, that means barbecue. But mentioning that word comes with a warning. It may start a fight. North Carolina's barbecue divide is as heated as any rivalry. In the East, whole hogs are cooked low and slow, chopped fine, and doused with a thin vinegar-based sauce tinged with pepper and heat. In the West, it's all about pork shoulders, served pulled or sliced, and coated with a sweeter tomato-based sauce known as Lexington style. Both sides claim supremacy. Both have loyalists willing to argue into the night over texture, smoke rings, and sauce thickness. But despite the division, barbecue unites more than it divides. It's a ritual of family gatherings, of roadside stands with smoke curling above gravel lots, of cinder block restaurants where the meat falls apart at the touch of a fork. It's where conversations begin and friendships deepen. In every small town, someone knows where the best pitmaster works, and that knowledge is treated like a birthright. Beyond the food and the music, there's another part of the North Carolina soul. Something less polished, a little more rebellious. It lives in the deep woods, in the back roads, in the legacy of moonshine. Long before craft distilleries appeared in glossy magazine spreads, North Carolinians were cooking up homemade whiskey in copper stills, tucked away from the eyes of revenuers. Born from necessity and sustained by ingenuity, moonshine was part enterprise, part defiance. During Prohibition, the state's mountain regions became epicenters of illegal liquor production. The white lightning flowed through hidden networks, and the fast cars needed to outrun the law evolved into something else entirely: stock car racing. That's right. NASCAR owes its origin to the moonshine runners of North Carolina, men who modified their vehicles to fly down dirt roads and escape federal agents. What started as a survival tactic turned into a national sport. The first organized races drew crowds to Charlotte and beyond. Names like Junior Johnson, a former moonshiner turned racing legend, linked the outlaw spirit to the roar of engines and the smell of burnt rubber. Even as NASCAR became a billion-dollar industry, it never forgot its roots. Many of the greatest drivers and most iconic tracks remain in the South. And North Carolina, home to the NASCAR Hall of Fame, sits firmly in the driver's seat. From bootlegging to banking, the journey of speed has always been a North Carolina story. And then there's language. The way North Carolinians speak, with a drawl that softens syllables and a rhythm that slows the clock. The accent shifts from mountains to coast, becoming thinner and faster in the tidewater towns, deeper and steadier in the hills. But always, there's a lilt of hospitality, a nod of gentility. You'll hear y'all used with ease, not out of affectation, but as an efficient act of inclusion. You'll hear stories told in layers, with pauses and color, where the punchline doesn't matter as much as the telling. Faith is another thread in the cultural quilt. Churches dot the landscape, from tiny clapboard chapels to sprawling megachurches. Baptists and Methodists dominate. But Pentecostal churches, Catholic parishes, and increasingly diverse congregations speak to the changing fabric of the state. Gospel music remains a vital force, and Sunday mornings still anchor many communities, blending the sacred with the social. And of course, there's the pride. Deep, sometimes defiant, often unspoken, but always present. Tar Heels don't boast with the swagger of other states. They don't have to. It's a quieter pride, one rooted in resilience and contradiction. A pride that knows its state gave the world flight and gave itself over to justice, even if slowly. A pride that lives in the blue haze of the mountains and the salt air of the Outer Banks. A pride that understands history not as perfection, but as something to wrestle with and grow beyond. Today, the Tar Heel identity exists at the intersection of tradition and transformation. The same state that still debates barbecue styles and reveres March Madness also leads in biotech research and financial services. College towns buzz with intellectual energy, while mountain hollers keep centuries-old tunes alive. Immigrants have brought new rhythms, new cuisines, new stories, adding their verses to the North Carolina song. What binds it all together is not sameness, but story. North Carolina has always been a state of stories, told in song, shouted from bleachers, whispered across kitchen tables. Stories of hard-earned victories and homegrown heroes. Stories of a people who have built and rebuilt, struggled and soared. In the end, the Tar Heel identity isn't one thing. It's a harmony of contradictions. Moonshine and innovation, gospel and protest, basketball and bluegrass, grit and grace. It's what happens when roots run deep and branches reach wide. It's North Carolina. Not just a place on a map, but a feeling, a rhythm, a way of seeing the world. And for those who call it home, there's no mistaking it. It's something you carry, something you wear, something you sing, cheer, cook, and fight for. It's the Tar Heel way, and it lives in every note, every game, every bite, and every beat of the heart. Chapter 15. Politics and Polarization in the Modern Era. By the turn of the 21st century, North Carolina had evolved into one of America's most dynamic and complex states. It was no longer defined by a single economy, a single party, or a single identity. The old binaries, rural and urban, black and white, poor and wealthy, had been complicated by new arrivals, new technologies, and new battles. It had become a place of astonishing growth, fierce political competition, and cultural collision. And as the nation itself grew more divided, North Carolina found itself in the thick of the struggle. Its soil tilled not only by farmers and developers, but by the forces of polarization that swept across the American landscape. From the beginning of the new century, it was clear that North Carolina would not be a quiet observer in national politics. It would be a battleground. Once considered a reliably conservative southern state, North Carolina began shifting in the early 2000s. Its population was changing fast. Urban centers like Charlotte, Raleigh, and Durham were booming, fueled by transplants from across the country and around the world. College graduates, immigrants, and retirees arrived with new ideas and different expectations. Suburbs expanded. The research triangle drew talent from every continent. And with that demographic shift came a political one. No election captured that transformation more vividly than 2008. That year, a young senator from Illinois named Barack Obama carried North Carolina by a razor-thin margin, becoming the first Democrat to win the state in a presidential election since Jimmy Carter in 1976. His victory was powered by a coalition of black voters, young professionals, suburban moderates, and energized college students. The turnout was historic. For a moment, it seemed North Carolina had turned a page. But in politics, no page stays turned for long. Just 2 years later, in 2010, a conservative wave swept the nation, and North Carolina rode it hard. Republicans gained control of both chambers of the state legislature for the first time in over a century. They quickly redrew legislative and congressional districts through gerrymandering so precise it was likened to surgery. Critics accused lawmakers of undermining democracy. Supporters called it a political masterstroke. The courts would battle over the maps for years, but the impact was immediate. Conservative legislators enacted sweeping reforms that would redefine state politics for the next decade. One of the most controversial was the passage of House Bill 2 in 2016, widely known as the Bathroom Bill. Designed to require individuals to use public restrooms that corresponded with their biological sex as listed on their birth certificate. The bill was quickly condemned as discriminatory toward transgender people. National corporations threatened boycotts. Musicians canceled concerts. The NCAA pulled championship games from the state. North Carolina, once celebrated for its economic and educational progress, was suddenly the subject of international criticism. For many, it was a flashpoint in the larger culture wars about identity, privacy, tradition, and change. The backlash was swift. Governor Pat McCrory, who had signed the bill into law, lost re-election that same year to Democrat Roy Cooper. The law was eventually repealed in a compromise that pleased few. But the episode revealed just how polarized the state had become and how national the stakes were in North Carolina's backyard. Beneath the culture wars, economic transformation continued. Charlotte's rise as a banking giant accelerated. Raleigh and Durham attracted tech firms and startups. Asheville grew into a hub for tourism and alternative culture. Wilmington became a key player in film and digital media. The coast drew retirees. The mountains drew artisans. New construction boomed across suburban counties, while housing prices soared. But prosperity wasn't evenly distributed. In rural eastern counties, textile and manufacturing jobs had vanished. In the western mountains, opioid addiction and underemployment gripped forgotten corners. The same state that built satellites and financed billion-dollar mergers still wrestled with poverty, underfunded schools, and food insecurity. The disparities fed resentment. Many rural voters felt left behind, unheard by urban elites and coastal lawmakers. In counties where tobacco barns once stood and mills had closed, voters turned redder, angrier, more populist. Meanwhile, urban and suburban counties grew bluer, more progressive, and more diverse. The state became a mirror of America's divide. Geography, education, and ideology pulling in different directions. Debates over immigration added to the tension. As North Carolina's immigrant population grew, especially Latin American, Southeast Asian, and African communities, so did the political noise around who belonged. Undocumented workers became the focus of heated policy fights. Sheriffs in some counties cooperated closely with federal immigration authorities. Others refused. Activists marched in the streets for DACA recipients and migrant families. Farmers, who relied on immigrant labor to pick crops and work in poultry plants, found themselves caught between politics and economics. Meanwhile, the state's electoral systems became battlegrounds in their own right. Voter ID laws were passed and struck down. Sunday voting was restricted, then restored. Voting sites were moved, lines grew longer, and lawsuits piled up. A 2016 federal court ruling stated that lawmakers had targeted African American voters with almost surgical precision. The legitimacy of elections, once taken for granted, became a topic of fierce dispute. Faith in the process, once a point of pride in the state's democratic tradition, began to fray. And then, as if testing North Carolina's strength further, came the hurricanes. Storms are no strangers to the Carolina coast. But in the 21st century, their size and frequency increased. Hurricane Floyd in 1999 had already devastated large swaths of eastern North Carolina, especially poor, Black, and rural communities. But it was Hurricane Matthew in 2016 and Hurricane Florence in 2018 that left wounds still felt today. Towns were swallowed. Rivers spilled over. Entire neighborhoods disappeared underwater. The National Guard was deployed. Rescue boats floated down suburban streets. And always, once the water receded, the hardest hit were those with the least. Rebuilding became political. FEMA support, state emergency funds, insurance payouts, all moved slowly. Some communities waited years for housing, infrastructure, and recovery. Climate change, once an abstract debate, became painfully real. Eastern North Carolina, flat, poor, and exposed, now faced not just economic uncertainty but existential threat. And still, people rebuilt. Because in North Carolina, resilience is not a slogan, it's survival. Through all the upheaval, the state continued to play an outsized role in national politics. Every 4 years, its 15 electoral votes became a prize both parties fought to the wire. In 2020, it was again one of the most hotly contested states. Democrats poured money and organizers into the suburbs. Republicans shored up rural turnout. Joe Biden came within a percentage point of flipping the state, but Donald Trump held it. The U.S. Senate race that year was also razor close. And North Carolina's place on the national stage, uncertain, contested, essential, remained intact. Yet beneath the surface of conflict, something else persisted: engagement. North Carolinians, whatever their party, voted in high numbers. They attended city council meetings, ran for school boards, called legislators, and debated policy with passion and knowledge. The state that had once been known for voter suppression became, paradoxically, one of the most politically active. Tar Heels didn't just argue, they organized. They didn't just complain, they ran for office. Teachers marched on Raleigh to demand better pay. Clergy led moral marches against injustice. Veterans ran campaigns to protect voting rights. Students launched movements on climate and racial equity. The spirit of protest, born in the sit-ins of Greensboro, never died. It simply changed clothes. That spirit was tested again in 2020, when the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis sparked nationwide protests. In Raleigh, Charlotte, Durham, and smaller towns, thousands marched for racial justice, holding signs and chanting names. They stood where, decades earlier, their parents and grandparents had stood. And just like then, they were met with both support and opposition. Buildings were boarded up. Tear gas filled the streets. Statues of Confederate soldiers, once untouchable, were pulled down. The past, unresolved and unfinished, rose again. Through it all, North Carolina kept walking its tightrope. A state too complicated to be neatly labeled, too restless to be boxed in. A place where the son of a mill worker could become governor and a black woman could lead a statewide Supreme Court. Where a trans kid might face bullying in school but find support in a courtroom. Where barbecue debates could coexist with biotech innovation. Where hurricanes tear things down and voters build them back up. The political polarization is real, but it isn't the full story. The full story is messier. It's neighbors helping neighbors after a flood. It's families divided at the dinner table but united in pride over a Tar Heel basketball win. It's rural towns that send kids off to Duke or UNC and welcome them back with hope. It's a state still searching for balance, not afraid to grow, but unwilling to forget where it came from. North Carolina's political journey in the modern era has been anything but smooth. It has swung red and blue, been lifted by prosperity and battered by storms, torn by culture wars and mended by community. It has served as a stage for the nation's fiercest debates, and a mirror reflecting its deepest divides. But if history has taught anything, it's that North Carolina doesn't stay down. It doesn't stay still. It argues, it adapts, it evolves. And somewhere between the courthouse and the barbecue pit, the protest sign and the ballot box, the hurricane shelter and the high-rise, the spirit of this place, resilient, passionate, flawed, and fiercely alive, keeps moving forward. Because that, more than anything, is what makes North Carolina what it is. A battleground, a home, a promise, a fight worth having, and a future still being written. Epilogue: The Soul of North Carolina. North Carolina is not easily summarized. It resists simplification, confounds stereotypes, and defies the neat lines drawn around so many states in the American imagination. It is a place where flight was born and where freedom was denied, where mountains cradled tradition and cities chased the future. A state shaped by revolution and rebellion, by red clay and rolling surf, by contradiction and compromise. And as the story of North Carolina moves into the next chapter, the past is never left behind. It lives in the soil, in the sound of a voice, in the very names of its towns and rivers. The soul of North Carolina has never been a fixed thing. It's a moving target, and it's still being written. To understand the soul of this place is to look not just at what has happened, but at how it has happened. It's in the story of a state founded by kings and carved by settlers, shaped by native nations and enslaved people, immigrants and industrialists, soldiers and scholars. It's in the voices of the Cherokee who once called these lands home long before the first ship reached Roanoke's shores. It's in the mystery of the lost colony, the turbulence of revolution, and the reluctant secession that drew it into the bloodiest war in American history. It's in the rhythm of the railroads and the defiant lift of the Wright Flyer. It's in the hum of a tobacco factory, the thump of a basketball on a hardwood court, the laughter in a barbecue joint, and the tears shed beneath floodwaters. It's also in the tension between past and future, progress and pain, unity and division. North Carolina has long walked the line between the old and the new. It carries the weight of slavery and segregation, and yet helped launch a movement that reshaped the nation. It suffered under Jim Crow and then gave rise to the sit-ins that sparked change. It has been home to both moral marches and culture wars, to breathtaking resilience and heartbreaking injustice. Its soul is not clean or tidy, but it is honest. And in that honesty, there is beauty. Resilience is a word that comes up often in the story of North Carolina, but it's more than just survival. It's the ability to adapt, to endure, to grow through fire and flood and failure. It's what built the Research Triangle from pine forests and transformed Charlotte into a banking empire. It's what pulled communities back together after hurricanes, after economic collapse, after betrayal. Resilience here is not just about bouncing back. It's about pressing forward, slowly, stubbornly, and with purpose. That resilience is woven into the people, not just the famous names carved in textbooks. It's in the mill worker who punched a clock through decades of change, the school teacher who showed up every morning to a crowded, underfunded classroom, the farmer who turned red clay into a living, the preacher who preached justice, even when the pews emptied, the mother who held her child's hand on the steps of an all-white school, knowing what waited inside, the student who sat at a Woolworth's lunch counter and refused to leave, the dreamer who stepped into the wind at Kitty Hawk. The story has always been bigger than the headlines. North Carolina is a swing state, yes, politically and culturally. But more than that, it is a state in motion, swinging between extremes, caught in the cross currents of tradition and transformation. It contains both the Bible Belt and the biotech belt. It votes red and blue, sometimes in the same breath. Its people pray on Sunday and protest on Monday. It can be conservative in instinct and progressive in spirit. It loves its past and questions it. It welcomes newcomers and guards its roots. It is a state of friction, and from that friction comes fire. And yet, for all its divides, there is something that holds North Carolina together. Maybe it's the land itself, the long curve of the Outer Banks, the deep green of the Piedmont, the misty rise of the Blue Ridge. Maybe it's the food, the music, the way people talk. Maybe it's the pride, a quiet, unshakable pride that doesn't need shouting. North Carolinians argue, sure, but they stay, they build, they vote, they show up. That's not nothing. That's the soul, too. This state has contributed to America in ways far greater than its size would suggest. It has sent soldiers to every war, ideas to every movement, inventions to every industry. It has birthed legends and movements, hosted revolutions and reconciliations. And for all it has endured, civil war, economic collapse, storms both literal and political, it keeps rising. The truth is, the soul of North Carolina cannot be pinned to one place, one moment, or one kind of person. It's too wide for that, too deep. It's the sound of bluegrass in a mountain holler and gospel in a downtown church. It's a basketball bouncing on asphalt and a drone launching from a tech lab. It's the memory of fields worked by enslaved hands and the fight for a future where every child can thrive. It's a hush before the tip-off at the Dean Dome, a crowd at a barbecue festival, a flag waving on a porch after a storm. It's complicated, but it's real. And most importantly, it's unfinished. The story of North Carolina is still being written. In city council chambers and classrooms, in voting booths and kitchens, in laboratories and churches and break rooms and ball fields. The next chapters will be shaped by the same forces that always have, by struggle and hope, by history and heart, by resilience and reinvention. North Carolina doesn't pretend to be perfect. It never has. But it is honest in its contradictions, brave in its reinvention, and stubborn in its faith that tomorrow can be better than yesterday. That, in the end, is the soul of North Carolina, a state that remembers, a state that reckons, and a state that keeps moving forward. Because the only way out is through, and the only way forward is together.